The moment Ms. Halstead's voice cut through the classroom, sharp, certain, dripping with condescension, Jamal Carter knew exactly what was happening. He'd seen that look before, the one adults wore when they'd already decided you were lying before you even opened your mouth. A four-star general? She held his career day paper like contaminated evidence, her smile thin as razor wire. Jamal, we've talked about the importance of honesty. 30 pairs of eyes locked onto him. His chest tightened. He wasn't prepared for this. Not today, not ever. But the truth was the truth, whether she believed it or not. Thank you for joining me today. Please stay until the end of this story. I promise you won't regret it. And drop a comment with your city so I can see how far Jamal's story travels. Now, let me take you back to where it all began. The morning had started like any other Wednesday in Arlington, Virginia. Jamal Carter woke to the sound of his mother humming in the kitchen, the smell of scrambled eggs drifting through their modest two-bedroom apartment. Sunlight filtered through curtains that had seen better days, casting geometric patterns across walls decorated with his younger sister's crayon artwork and a single-framed photograph. His father in dress uniform, medals gleaming, eyes forward with that particular intensity Jamal had learned meant duty first. He dressed carefully that morning. His best khakis, the button-down shirt his grandmother had sent for his birthday, sneakers scrubbed clean the night before. Career Day at Jefferson Elementary was a big deal. The kind of event where kids got to show off what made their families special. For most of fourth grade, Jamal had kept quiet about what his father did. Not because he wasn't proud. God, he was so proud his chest sometimes felt too small to contain it, but because his dad had taught him early that some truths were meant to be carried quietly. Security isn't just about who knows, General Solomon Carter had explained once, kneeling to Jamal's eye level in that way he had, making even the most serious conversations feel like they were between equals. It's about who needs to know. We serve the country best when we don't make ourselves targets, son. Understand? Jamal had nodded, even though he didn't fully understand then. He understood better now, after the third time his family had to move without warning, after his mother explained why they couldn't have their address listed anywhere public, after he learned not to answer certain questions about where his dad worked or what exactly he did at the office. But Career Day felt different. It felt safe. It was school, after all, a place where truth was supposed to matter, where teachers preached honesty like gospel every single day. His mother, Grace Carter, appeared in his doorway, coffee mug in hand, already dressed for her shift at the hospital. She was a registered nurse at Arlington Memorial, the kind who knew every patient's name and life story by the second day. Her scrubs were printed with cartoon characters that made kids smile even when they were scared. She smiled at Jamal now, that warm, encompassing smile that made him feel invincible. "You look very handsome, baby," she said softly. "You ready for today?" Jamal held up his assignment paper, 3 paragraphs about his father's career, written and rewritten until every word felt exactly right. "I think so. I hope people believe me." Grace's expression shifted, something protective flickering across her features. She crossed the room and sat on the edge of his bed, pulling him close. "Jamal Solomon Carter, you listen to me. Your father is one of the most decorated officers in the United States military. He's earned every star on those shoulders through sacrifice, intelligence, and integrity. You have nothing to be ashamed of and everything to be proud of. If you want to tell your class about him, you tell them the truth, the whole truth. And if anyone has a problem with that, they can take it up with me. Understood?" "Yes, ma'am." "Good." She kissed his forehead, lingering just a moment longer than usual. "Now, eat your breakfast. Your sister's already demolished half the eggs." The morning routine unfolded with familiar comfort. Breakfast at the small kitchen table, his 5-year-old sister Zara chattering about her own day at kindergarten, his mother's gentle reminders about homework and behavior. Their apartment wasn't much. Certainly nothing like the houses some of his classmates lived in, the ones with driveways and yards and rooms that echoed. But it was theirs. It was safe. It was enough. The bus ride to Jefferson Elementary took 15 minutes through tree-lined streets where autumn was just beginning to assert itself, leaves turning gold and crimson at their edges. Jamal sat with his best friend, Malik Green, a lanky kid with thick glasses and an encyclopedic knowledge of everything from astronomy to comic books. They'd been inseparable since second grade, bonded by a shared love of science fiction and a mutual understanding of what it meant to be black boys navigating spaces that didn't always make room for them. "You nervous?" Malik asked, nudging Jamal's shoulder. "A little," Jamal admitted. "Ms. Halstead's been, I don't know, weird lately." "Weird how?" Jamal struggled to articulate what he'd been noticing. Ms. Diane Halstead had been teaching at Jefferson Elementary for 23 years. She was a fixture, the kind of teacher who commanded respect through sheer force of presence and a reputation for running a tight ship. Parents requested her class. Administrators praised her consistency. Students either loved her or feared her, sometimes both simultaneously. But lately, Jamal had noticed things. The way her smile seemed warmer for certain kids, the ones whose parents were doctors or lawyers or owned businesses, the ones who lived in the big houses on the north side of the district. The way her patience wore thinner with others, the ones on free lunch, the ones whose parents worked nights or multiple jobs, the ones who showed up in hand-me-downs. It was nothing explicit, nothing you could point to and say, "There, that's wrong." It was more like a temperature, a climate. The way she'd linger over Sophie Richardson's presentations, praising her articulate delivery and sophisticated vocabulary. The way she'd cut Marcus Washington off mid-sentence, correcting his grammar with a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. The way she seemed to expect less from some and perfection from others, and everyone knew which category they fell into. "She's just picky," Jamal finally said. "Like, really picky about some stuff and not others. I don't know. Maybe I'm imagining it." "You're not," Malik said quietly. His own experiences with Halstead had been similarly confusing, praised for his math skills but constantly corrected for being too literal or overthinking things, as if his mind working differently was something to be managed rather than celebrated. Jefferson Elementary sat like a brick fortress at the corner of Highland and 7th, 3 stories of mid-century institutional architecture surrounded by chain-link fencing and a playground where the equipment had been updated sometime in the last decade. American flags flanked the main entrance, and inside, the halls smelled like floor wax and cafeteria mystery. Meat and that particular scent of children's energy barely contained by adult supervision. Room 204 occupied the northeast corner of the 2nd floor, windows overlooking the parking lot. Ms. Halstead had arranged the desks in precise rows, none of that collaborative group seating nonsense she'd explained on the first day, and decorated the walls with motivational posters about perseverance and success. A reading corner claimed one quadrant of the room, beanbags arranged around a bookshelf whose contents Halstead curated personally, removing books she deemed inappropriate or too controversial with regularity. By 9:30, the classroom buzzed with anticipatory energy. Parents had been invited to attend Career Day presentations, and several had taken time off work to be there. They lined the back wall, a jury of adults with phones ready to record their children's moments of glory. Sophie Richardson went first. Her father was a partner at a prestigious law firm downtown, and Sophie delivered her presentation with the kind of polish that came from private tutoring and parental coaching. "My father practices corporate law," she explained, her voice clear and confident. "He helps businesses navigate complex regulatory frameworks and merger acquisitions. His work requires analytical thinking and attention to detail." Ms. Halstead beamed. "Excellent work, Sophie. Such sophisticated vocabulary. You can really see the influence of an educated household." Jamal felt something twist in his stomach at that comment, but he pushed it aside. Next came Tyler Chen, whose mother was a dentist. Then Emma Rodriguez, whose father owned a restaurant. Then Marcus Washington, whose mother was a postal worker. And Jamal noticed how Halstead's praise cooled slightly, how she corrected Marcus's grammar twice and suggested he practice speaking more clearly. When Destiny Williams talked about her mom being a hairstylist, Halstead smiled that tight smile. "That's nice, Destiny. It's important to appreciate all kinds of work, even if some careers require more formal education than others." Malik caught Jamal's eye. There it was, that thing neither of them could quite name, but both of them could feel. Finally, it was Jamal's turn. He stood, paper trembling slightly in his hands, and walked to the front of the room. His mother couldn't be there. Her shift at the hospital didn't allow it. but he could feel her presence anyway, her voice in his head. Tell them the truth. The whole truth. My name is Jamal Carter, he began, his voice steadier than he expected. And I want to tell you about my father's career. He glanced down at his paper, at the words he'd chosen so carefully. My father is a 4-star general in the United States Army. He served our country for 26 years, including 3 deployments to conflict zones. His job is to make strategic decisions that protect American interests and keep soldiers safe. He advises the highest levels of government on military matters, and he commands thousands of people. But the most important thing about my dad isn't his rank. It's that he believes in service. He says true leadership means putting others first, even when it's hard, even when it's dangerous, even when no one's watching. Jamal looked up. Some of his classmates were staring with wide eyes. Others looked skeptical. He could see parents in the back exchanging glances, their expressions unreadable. But it was Ms. Halstead's face that made his heart drop. Her expression had gone flat, her jaw tight. She was staring at him with something that looked almost like disgust? No, not quite. Something colder. Something that made Jamal feel suddenly, viscerally exposed. A 4-star general, she repeated, her tone completely devoid of the warmth she'd used for Sophie or Tyler. Jamal, that's a very ambitious claim. The word ambitious landed like an accusation. It's not a claim, Jamal said carefully. It's true. Halstead's smile was thin and hard. Jamal, we've talked about the importance of honesty in this classroom, about the difference between facts and embellishment. The room went very, very quiet. I'm not embellishing, Jamal said, his voice smaller now. My dad really is a general. I can show you. Sit down, please. But sit down. Jamal stood frozen for a moment, paper still in his hand, his entire body hot with humiliation and confusion. He hadn't done anything wrong. He'd told the truth, exactly what teachers always said to do. So why did he feel like he'd committed some terrible crime? Slowly, legs shaking, he returned to his desk. Behind him, he heard whispers starting, kids leaning toward each other with that particular energy that preceded rumors and playground gossip. Malik reached over and squeezed his shoulder under the desk. It helped, but only barely. Ms. Halstead continued the presentations as if nothing had happened, but the atmosphere had shifted. Everyone could feel it, that particular tension when something unspoken and uncomfortable has entered a room and nobody knows quite how to address it. During lunch, Jamal barely touched his food. The cafeteria noise crashed over him in waves, laughter, shouts, the clatter of trays. But he felt separate from it all, sealed behind a wall of confusion and hurt. She didn't believe you, Malik said flatly. It wasn't a question. No. That's messed up, man. Why would you lie about something like that? Exactly. Jamal pushed his chicken nuggets around his tray. It's not like saying your dad's a superhero or something. It's real. It's just real. So what are you going to do? I don't know. My mom's working. I can't call her. My dad's... He trailed off. His father was somewhere he couldn't name, doing something he couldn't discuss, unreachable by any normal means. That was the job. That was the life. Maybe it'll blow over, Malik offered, without much conviction. It did not blow over. At the end of the day, as students packed their backpacks and prepared for dismissal, Ms. Halstead's voice cut through the classroom chatter. Jamal Carter, please stay behind. Everyone else is dismissed. Jamal's stomach dropped. Around him, kids exchanged knowing looks, the kind that said someone was in trouble, someone was about to get lectured, someone's day was about to get worse. Malik hesitated at the door, his expression worried, but Halstead waved him on impatiently. You too, Mr. Green. Out. When the room had emptied, Halstead closed the door with deliberate care. She turned to face Jamal, arms crossed, her expression a mixture of disappointment and something harder. We need to talk about what happened today, she said. Jamal stood beside his desk, backpack still on, feeling suddenly very small in the empty classroom. I told the truth. No, Halstead said firmly. You told a story. There's a difference. It's not a story. My dad really is Jamal. She cut him off with a raised hand. I understand that sometimes, when we come from certain backgrounds, we might feel the need to make ourselves seem more impressive than we are, to compete with classmates who have advantages we don't have. And I want you to know that I understand that impulse. I even have some compassion for it. Each word landed like a small, carefully placed cut. But, Halstead continued, moving closer, what I cannot and will not tolerate is dishonesty. Do you understand the position you put me in today? In front of parents? In front of your peers? Making these wild claims about your family? They're not wild claims, Jamal said, his voice cracking slightly. They're true. I can prove it. I can have my mom call. I'm sure your mother works very hard, Halstead interrupted, her tone dripping with condescension. But Jamal, think about this logically. 4-star generals are extraordinarily rare. There are only a handful in the entire military at any given time. These are men who've attended West Point, who come from military families, who've spent decades climbing the ranks. They live in specific housing. They have public profiles, security details. She paused, letting her words sink in. And you live in a 2-bedroom apartment in a complex off Route 50. You're on free lunch. Your mother takes the bus to work. Does that sound like a general's family to you? Jamal felt something inside him cracking, something fundamental and important. Because what she was saying wasn't entirely wrong. Those things were all true. But she was using true things to construct a false narrative, and he could feel the trap of it, the way facts could be arranged to make truth look like lies. My dad keeps a low profile, Jamal said desperately. For security. He's explained it to me. We don't live flashy because it's safer. Or, Halstead interjected, perhaps your father has told you stories to make you feel special. Perhaps he's exaggerated his role. Perhaps, and I mean this gently, Jamal, you've misunderstood what he does. Maybe he works on a military base in some capacity. And over time, in your imagination, that's become something grander. No. Jamal's hands were shaking now. That's not what happened. He is a general. He has the uniform. He has the stars. I've seen them. Jamal, you're making this worse. I'm giving you an opportunity here, a chance to admit you made a mistake, to apologize, and we can move forward. But if you continue down this path of dishonesty, I'm not being dishonest. The words burst out of him, louder than he intended, echoing off the empty classroom walls. Halstead's expression hardened. Lower your voice, right now. Jamal's chest heaved. He felt tears threatening, hot and humiliating behind his eyes, and he willed them back with everything he had. He would not cry. He would not give her that. I want you to go home tonight, Halstead said coldly, and think very carefully about the story you told today. Tomorrow, during morning announcements, you're going to stand in front of the class and apologize for wasting everyone's time with false information. You're going to admit that you let your imagination get the better of you. And then, Jamal, we're going to talk about the consequences for lying. I didn't lie. Tomorrow morning, first thing, are we clear? Jamal stared at her, this woman who was supposed to be an educator, supposed to care about truth and justice and all the things teachers always claim to stand for. He saw her fully in that moment, saw the assumptions she'd made, the conclusions she'd drawn based not on evidence but on his address, his clothes, his skin, the shape of his life as she imagined it. Are we clear? She repeated. Yes, ma'am, he whispered, because what else could he say? Good. You're dismissed. Jamal walked out of that classroom and into the hallway where late buses were loading, where kids were shouting about homework and plans, where everything was normal except him. He felt like he was carrying something heavy and sharp, something that was cutting him from the inside out. Malik was waiting by the exit, backpack slung over one shoulder, his expression serious. What happened? She wants me to apologize, Jamal said numbly. Tomorrow. In front of everyone, she wants me to say I lied. That's insane. You didn't lie. She doesn't believe me. She thinks... He couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't articulate the full weight of what Halstead thought, what she'd implied, what she'd decided about him and his family based on the thinnest evidence. Come on, Malik said. Let's get you home. The bus ride passed in a blur. Jamal stared out the window at familiar streets that suddenly felt foreign, his mind spinning through possibilities and problems. He could tell his mother, but she was working a double shift and wouldn't be home until late. He could try to contact his father, but that was complicated and often impossible, depending on where he was and what he was doing. He was trapped, caught between the truth and someone else's refusal to believe it. Their apartment felt hollow when he walked in. His grandmother, who'd been watching Zara, greeted him with her usual warmth, but even that couldn't penetrate the fog around him. He mumbled something about homework and disappeared into his room, closing the door on the world. He sat on his bed, pulled out his phone, a basic model, heavily monitored by his parents, and stared at the single photo he kept saved. His father in dress uniform, taken at some official ceremony Jamal had been too young to remember. 4 stars gleamed on the shoulder boards. Medals decorated the chest. But most of all, Jamal saw his father's eyes. Kind, serious, certain. What would his dad do? What would he say? Tell the truth. Stand in it. Don't let anyone make you smaller than you are. But what if the truth wasn't enough? What if nobody listened? What if the whole world decided that your reality was impossible because it didn't fit their assumptions about who you were supposed to be? Jamal didn't have answers. He only had the weight of tomorrow looming, the humiliation of a forced apology hanging over him, and the terrible knowledge that sometimes being right wasn't the same as being believed. That night, when his mother finally came home around 10, exhausted from her shift, she found him still awake, lying in bed staring at the ceiling. She sat beside him, her hand cool against his forehead, and asked the question parents always ask. "What's wrong, baby?" And Jamal, who'd held it together all day, who'd refused to cry in front of Halstead or his classmates or even Malik, finally let himself break. The story spilled out, the presentation, the accusation, the trap, the impossible choice between lying and being punished for truth. Grace listened without interrupting, her jaw tightening with each detail, her eyes growing harder. When Jamal finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said something that surprised him. "You're not apologizing." "But Ms. Halstead said—" "I don't care what Ms. Halstead said." Grace's voice was steel wrapped in velvet. "You told the truth. You have nothing to apologize for, and tomorrow, baby, we're going to make sure everyone knows exactly who your father is." "How?" His mother smiled, a smile that held fury and determination and unshakable certainty. "Leave that to me. For now, you sleep. Tomorrow is going to be a very interesting day." Jamal wanted to believe her, wanted to trust that somehow, some way, the truth would win out. But as he finally drifted toward sleep, uncertainty gnawed at him. Because he'd learned something terrible that day, something that would stay with him long after this moment passed. That truth could be fragile, that belief could be weaponized, and that sometimes the very people who were supposed to protect you were the ones who hurt you most. Tomorrow would come, whether he was ready or not. And somewhere in the distance, though Jamal didn't know it yet, his father's phone was buzzing with an urgent message from his wife. A message that would set in motion events that would change everything about the next day at Jefferson Elementary. General Solomon Carter read his wife's text 3 times, his expression darkening with each pass. Then he made a phone call. Then another. Then he began making arrangements that involved security protocols, official channels, and a very clear message. His son had been wronged, and that wrong was about to be corrected in a way that would leave no room for doubt. But that part of the story, the reckoning, the revelation, the moment when assumptions collided with undeniable reality, that was still hours away. For now, in a modest apartment in Arlington, a 10-year-old boy slept fitfully, carrying the weight of an accusation that wasn't fair and a truth that nobody seemed willing to believe. And in a house across town, a teacher slept soundly, certain in her judgments, confident in her assessment, completely unaware that she'd made the kind of mistake that would define the rest of her career. The stage was set. The players were in position. And morning, with all its complications and confrontations, was coming fast. Morning arrived with the kind of crystalline autumn clarity that made everything seem sharper, more defined. Jamal woke before his alarm, his stomach already twisted in knots, and lay staring at the ceiling while dawnlight crept across his room. He could hear his mother moving in the kitchen, the familiar sounds of breakfast preparation, but something felt different, purposeful, deliberate. When he emerged, still in his pajamas, he found her already dressed, not in scrubs, but in what she called her business clothes. A navy blazer over a cream blouse, slacks pressed to knife-edge precision, her hair styled in a way that meant she was preparing for battle, even if the battlefield looked like a polite conversation. "You're not working today?" Jamal asked. Grace looked up from her coffee, and her expression was calm but absolute. "I called in, told them I had a family emergency, which is true." She gestured to the table. "Sit, eat. We need to talk before school." Jamal slid into his chair while Zara munched on cereal, oblivious to the tension crackling through the apartment. His mother placed a plate of eggs and toast in front of him, then sat across from him with her own coffee, her hands wrapped around the mug like she was drawing strength from its warmth. "Last night, after you went to sleep, I called your father," she said quietly. "It took 3 different channels and a priority code, but I reached him. And Jamal, baby, he is not happy. Not with the situation, and definitely not with how you were treated." Jamal's heart kicked up. Is he coming home?" "He's making arrangements. That's all I can tell you right now." She reached across the table and took his hand. "But here's what's going to happen today. You're going to school. You're going to walk into that classroom with your head up. And you are not, absolutely not, going to apologize for telling the truth. Do you understand me?" "But Ms. Halstead said—" "I don't care what Ms. Halstead said. That woman made assumptions based on ignorance and prejudice. And she's about to learn a very important lesson about the danger of judging people by their circumstances rather than their character." Grace's voice was quiet, but there was iron underneath. "Sometimes, baby, the world is going to look at you and decide they know your whole story based on what they see on the surface. Your dress, your clothes, your skin, and they're going to be wrong, dead wrong. And when that happens, you have 2 choices. You can make yourself smaller to fit their expectations, or you can stand in your truth and make them expand their understanding. Your father and I chose the second option a long time ago, and we're teaching you to do the same. What if she tries to punish me? She won't get the chance." Grace squeezed his hand. "Trust me on this. I'm coming with you to school this morning. I've already contacted Principal Morrison. We're having a meeting before classes start." Relief and anxiety warred in Jamal's chest. He wanted his mother there, wanted backup, wanted someone who believed him standing beside him. But he also knew what it meant when parents showed up at school. It made you a target, made you the kid whose mom had to fight his battles. Grace seemed to read his thoughts. "I know you're worried about how this looks, but Jamal, some battles you fight alone, and some battles you need reinforcements for. This is the second kind. What Ms. Halstead did wasn't just wrong, it was damaging. And if we don't address it now, clearly and completely, it sets a precedent. It tells her and everyone else that it's okay to dismiss you, to assume the worst about you, to treat your truth as suspicious simply because of who you are." She paused, letting that sink in. "Your father and I have spent our entire lives fighting assumptions. Him in a military that didn't always make space for Black excellence. Me in a healthcare system that doesn't always take Black women's pain seriously. We know what it costs to constantly prove yourself, to have your credentials questioned, to work twice as hard for half the recognition. And we'll be damned if we let our son grow up thinking that's acceptable." Jamal swallowed hard. "What's going to happen?" "The truth is going to come out, completely, undeniably, in a way that leaves no room for doubt." Grace's smile was small and fierce. "And then, baby, we're going to watch people recalibrate real fast." They arrived at Jefferson Elementary 40 minutes before the first bell, the parking lot still mostly empty except for teachers' cars and the early bus. Grace walked beside Jamal with the kind of presence that made people look twice, shoulders back, head high, moving with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what they were worth and wasn't interested in negotiating. Principal Harold Morrison was waiting in his office, a man in his late 50s with thinning hair and the perpetually worried expression of someone who'd spent 3 decades managing the chaos of elementary education. He stood when Grace entered, extending his hand with cautious professionalism. "Mrs. Carter, thank you for coming in. Please, have a seat." "I'll stand, thank you." Grace's voice was cordial but firm. "This won't take long. I'm here because yesterday, your teacher, Ms. Halstead, publicly accused my son of lying about his father's military service. She then kept him after class, intimidated him, and demanded he apologize to his classmates for what she called dishonesty and embellishment. I'd like to know what policies Jefferson Elementary has regarding teachers making accusations against students without verification, and what consequences exist for educators who engage in that behavior. Morrison's face went carefully blank. Mrs. Carter, I'm sure there's been some misunderstanding. There's been no misunderstanding. Jamal, tell Principal Morrison exactly what happened yesterday. Jamal recounted the story, his voice steadier than he expected, with Grace occasionally interjecting questions that forced him to be specific. What exactly did she say? How did she say it? Who else was present? By the time he finished, Morrison looked deeply uncomfortable. He cleared his throat. Ms. Halstead has been with us for over 20 years. She's an experienced educator with an excellent track record. I don't care if she's been here 50 years, Grace interrupted. What I care about is that she looked at my 10-year-old son, made assumptions based on where we live and what she thinks she knows about us, and then publicly humiliated him for telling the truth. That's not teaching. That's bias. And if this school's position is to defend that behavior rather than correct it, then we have a much bigger problem. Mrs. Carter, I understand you're upset, but upset? Grace's laugh was sharp. Mr. Morrison, I am far beyond upset. I am standing in your office at 7:30 in the morning because your employee damaged my child. Do you understand what it means for a black boy to be called a liar in front of his peers? To have his truth dismissed as fantasy? To be told that his reality is impossible because it doesn't match someone else's narrow expectations? That's not just educational malpractice. That's trauma. And if this school can't recognize that, can't address that, then we're going to have a very different conversation involving the school board and possibly lawyers. Morrison raised his hands in a placating gesture. Mrs. Carter, please, let's not escalate this unnecessarily. I'm happy to speak with Ms. Halstead to clarify the situation. Clarify? Grace's eyes flashed. There's nothing to clarify. My husband is a 4-star general. That's a fact. It's verifiable. And instead of verification, your teacher chose humiliation. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to call Ms. Halstead in here right now. Jamal and I are going to tell her exactly who his father is, and then you're both going to figure out how to make this right. Mrs. Carter, I really don't think... The words died in his throat as his desk phone buzzed. His secretary's voice came through, tight with something that might have been nervousness. Mr. Morrison, there are several vehicles in the parking lot. Security personnel. They're asking for you. Morrison's face went pale. What? Security? What are you talking about? Grace's smile was serene. Oh, that would be my husband's advance team. He takes security very seriously, particularly when it involves his family. I'd suggest you come see for yourself. Morrison stood so quickly, his chair rolled backward. He moved to the window overlooking the front parking lot and went absolutely still. Grace joined him, Jamal trailing behind, his heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. Below, the parking lot had transformed. 3 black SUVs with tinted windows sat in a precise formation near the entrance. Men and women in dark suits and subtle earpieces had taken positions around the perimeter, their bearing unmistakably military despite the civilian clothes. A 4th vehicle was just pulling up, larger, more official, with government plates. What? Morrison's voice cracked. What is happening? My husband is arriving, Grace said simply. I told you, he's a 4-star general. They tend to travel with security details, standard protocol for someone at his level. Morrison turned to stare at her, then at Jamal, his expression cycling through disbelief, shock, and dawning horror. You're serious. You're actually serious. As a heart attack, Grace replied. Would you like to call Ms. Halstead now, or should we wait until my husband gets inside? Morrison practically ran to his phone, jabbing the intercom button with shaking fingers. Marie, page Ms. Halstead to my office immediately. Tell her it's urgent. They waited in loaded silence. Through the window, Jamal watched as a man emerged from the 4th vehicle, tall, broad-shouldered, moving with the kind of authority that made people instinctively straighten their spines. Even from this distance, even in a standard suit rather than uniform, there was no mistaking General Solomon Carter. He spoke briefly with his security team, then turned toward the building's entrance. Jamal's chest felt like it might burst. His father was here. actually here. In the middle of a workday, despite whatever crucial responsibilities he'd been handling, because his son had been wronged. Footsteps in the hallway announced Ms. Halstead's arrival before she appeared. She entered the office with an expression of mild irritation, clearly expecting another tedious administrative matter to handle before classes started. When she saw Grace and Jamal, her face hardened. "Oh, I see we're having this conversation." She crossed her arms. "Mr. Morrison, I've already addressed this situation with Jamal. He knows what he needs to do." "Does he?" Grace's voice was dangerously quiet. "Please, Ms. Halstead, enlighten us. What exactly does my son need to do?" Halstead's eyes narrowed. "He needs to apologize to his classmates for lying about his father's military rank. I understand that some children feel pressure to compete with their peers, but dishonesty cannot be tolerated." "My husband," Grace interrupted, "is General Solomon Carter, 4 stars, 26 years of service, currently serving at the Pentagon as a senior military advisor. He graduated from West Point in 1999, has commanded multiple units including the 101st Airborne Division, holds 3 Defense Distinguished Service Medals, and has advised 3 different administrations on military strategy. Those are facts, Ms. Halstead. Verifiable, documented facts. And my son recited them yesterday in your classroom because it was career day and he was proud of his father, as he should be." Halstead's face had gone rigid. If that's true, then surely you can understand my confusion. A family living in your circumstances, our circumstances? Grace took a step forward. "Please explain to me exactly what you mean by that." Morrison interjected desperately. "Ladies, please, let's remain professional." "No." Grace didn't take her eyes off Halstead. "I want to hear this. I want to hear Miss..." Halstead explained exactly what assumptions she made about my family, based on where we live, how much our rent costs, whether my son's sneakers are new or used, whether I take the bus or drive a Mercedes. Because that's what this is really about, isn't it? You looked at a black child from a modest apartment and decided his truth was impossible. You didn't verify. You didn't investigate. You didn't give him the benefit of the doubt. You just decided. Halstead's mouth opened and closed. That's not... I was trying to teach about honesty." "You were exercising your biases," Grace said flatly. "And you hurt my child in the process. You humiliated him in front of his peers. You called his truth a lie. You made him feel small and wrong and suspicious for daring to be exactly who he is." "Mrs. Carter," Morrison tried again, his voice pleading now. "I'm sure Miss..." Halstead didn't intend... Whatever else he might have said vanished as the office door opened and General Solomon Carter walked in. The room didn't just go quiet, it went airless. Even in civilian clothes, a dark suit, white shirt, no tie, there was something about the general that commanded immediate attention. Maybe it was his bearing, decades of military discipline visible in every line of his posture. Maybe it was his eyes, sharp and assessing, taking in the entire scene in seconds. Maybe it was simply the presence that came with genuine authority, the kind that didn't need to announce itself because everyone could feel it. He looked at Jamal first, his expression softening for just a moment. "Hey, son." "Dad." Jamal's voice cracked, and suddenly he was moving, crossing the room to where his father stood. Solomon knelt, despite the suit, despite the formal setting, and pulled his son into a hug that felt like safety and vindication and love all wrapped together. "I'm proud of you," Solomon murmured, quiet enough that only Jamal could hear, "for telling the truth, for standing in it. Never apologize for being who you are." Then he stood, his hand resting on Jamal's shoulder, and turned to face the room. His eyes found Ms. Halstead, and his expression went professionally neutral, which was somehow more intimidating than anger would have been. "Ms. Halstead, I presume." She nodded mutely. All her earlier confidence evaporated. "I'm General Solomon Carter, United States Army. I understand you've been having some concerns about my son's honesty." His tone was conversational, almost gentle. "I'd like to address those concerns." "General, there's been a misunderstanding." "Has there?" Solomon pulled out his phone, tapped a few buttons, and held up the screen. This is my official Pentagon identification. Here's my service record, accessible through the Department of Defense website. Here's a photo from last month's Joint Chiefs meeting. Would you like me to verify anything else? Halstead stared at the screen like it might bite her. That won't be necessary. Good. Because here's what I want to make absolutely clear. Solomon's voice remained calm, but there was steel underneath now. My son came to school yesterday prepared to share something he was proud of. His father's career, his father's service, his father's sacrifice. And instead of being celebrated or even simply believed, he was accused of lying. He was humiliated. He was told his truth was impossible because it didn't match your expectations of what a general's family looks like. He paused, letting that land. Ms. Halstead, do you know why my family lives in a modest apartment instead of on-base housing? Security. Do you know why we keep a low profile? Security. Do you know why my wife takes public transportation and my kids attend public school? Because we want them to have normal lives, to understand that service isn't about status or show, and because, frankly, being visible makes us targets. But apparently, those choices made for legitimate reasons, led you to conclude that my son must be a liar. Halstead's face had gone from pale to flushed, her hands twisting together. I thought I was teaching about honesty. You were teaching about assumptions, Solomon corrected. You were teaching that some children are believable and others aren't, based on criteria that have nothing to do with truth or character. And that, Ms. Halstead, is a lesson my son didn't need. Morrison had been standing frozen, clearly trying to figure out how to navigate this situation that had escalated far beyond anything in his administrative playbook. General Carter, I apologize for this misunderstanding. I'm sure Ms. Halstead meant no harm. Solomon's gaze shifted to the principal. Respectfully, Mr. Morrison, intent doesn't erase impact. My son was harmed. And here's what concerns me most, that this wasn't just a simple mistake. According to my wife, Ms. Halstead kept Jamal after class, isolated him, pressured him to confess to lying, and demanded he apologize publicly today. That's not a misunderstanding. That's systematic intimidation of a child. The words hung in the air like an indictment. Halstead's composure finally cracked. I was trying to do what was right. I genuinely thought he was making it up. You have to understand, General, in 23 years of teaching, I've seen children exaggerate. Have you? Grace interjected. Or have you just believed certain children and doubted others? Because I'm curious, Miss Halstead, when Sophie Richardson talked about her father being a partner at a law firm, did you verify that? When Tyler Chen's mother claimed to be a dentist, did you check her credentials? Or did you just believe them because they lived in the right neighborhood and looked the right way? Halstead opened her mouth, then closed it again. The answer was written all over her face. Solomon spoke again, his voice quieter now, but no less firm. Here's what's going to happen. My son is owed an apology, a real one, specific and accountable, in front of the same classmates who witnessed his humiliation. This school is going to implement policies about verification before accusation, and someone, whether it's you, Mr. Morrison, or someone at the district level, is going to seriously examine how bias operates in this building. General Carter, I assure you, Morrison began. I'm not finished. Solomon's tone remained even. I'm also going to be frank about something else. My wife and I made choices about how to raise our children that prioritize normalcy and security over status. But those choices do not, should never, make our children targets for suspicion. And if this school cannot guarantee that every student's truth will be approached with basic respect and verification rather than judgment based on zip codes and lunch assistance, then we have a fundamental problem. He looked directly at Halstead. I don't believe you're a bad person, Ms. Halstead, but I do believe you made a bad choice, rooted in biases you may not even be fully aware of. And those biases hurt my son. So the question isn't whether you meant harm. The question is, what are you going to do now to make it right? The silence that followed was dense and uncomfortable. Finally, Halstead spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm sorry. Not to me, Solomon said, to him. He gestured to Jamal. Halstead turned to face Jamal fully, and for the first time she looked at him, really looked at him, not as a problem to be managed or a suspicious story to be debunked, but as a child she'd wounded. Tears gathered at the corners of her eyes. "Jamal, I owe you an apology, a real one." Her voice shook. "I made assumptions about you and your family based on circumstances I didn't understand and biases I wasn't even aware I was carrying. I didn't verify what you told me. I didn't give you the benefit of the doubt. And instead of treating you with the respect and dignity every student deserves, I humiliated you in front of your classmates and made you feel like your truth wasn't valid. That was wrong, completely wrong. And I'm sorry." She paused, wiping at her eyes. "There's no excuse for what I did. Your father's service is real and honorable, and you had every right to be proud of it. I should have celebrated that with you instead of questioning it. I should have been better. I failed you, and I'm genuinely, deeply sorry." Jamal stood very still, his father's hand steady on his shoulder. Part of him wanted to accept the apology immediately, to make the uncomfortable feeling in the room go away. But another part, a part that sounded like his mother's voice, knew that accepting too quickly meant letting the moment pass without real change. "Thank you for apologizing," he said quietly. "But I need to know, are you going to change? Because there are other kids like me, kids who don't fit what you expect, and they deserve to be believed too." Halstead nodded, fresh tears spilling over. "Yes, I'm going to change. I promise you, Jamal. I'm going to do better." Morrison finally found his voice. "General Carter, Mrs. Carter, I want to assure you that Jefferson Elementary takes these matters very seriously. We'll be implementing mandatory bias training for all staff, and we'll review our policies regarding student accusations to ensure this doesn't happen again." "See that you do," Grace said, "because we're not the only parents watching. And if this incident teaches nothing else, it should teach that you can't judge a book by its cover or a general's son by his address." Solomon checked his watch, a subtle but clear signal. "I have to return to Washington, but I want to make one more thing clear before I go." He addressed the room generally, but seemed to be speaking to Halstead specifically. "Service means putting others first, even when it's hard, even when it requires examining your own prejudices and changing your behavior. Every day I ask soldiers to do the hard thing, the right thing, even when it's uncomfortable. I expect no less from the people educating my children." He looked down at Jamal. "You good, son?" Jamal nodded, something loosening in his chest. "Yes, sir." "Then I'll see you tonight. Your mom's making pot roast." Solomon ruffled Jamal's hair, kissed Grace's cheek, shook Morrison's hand with professional courtesy, and nodded once to Halstead. Then he was gone, his security detail falling into formation around him as he exited the building. Through the window, they watched the vehicles depart with the same precise coordination they'd arrived with, leaving the parking lot suddenly, starkly ordinary. Morrison exhaled shakily. "Well, that was—" He couldn't seem to find words adequate to the moment. "Educational," Grace supplied. She turned to Halstead. "I expect you to make this right in your classroom today. Not just an apology, but a real conversation about assumptions and verification and treating people with dignity." "I will," Halstead promised. "I absolutely will." As they walked toward room 204, Jamal felt the weight of the last 24 hours beginning to lift, replaced by something he couldn't quite name yet. Not triumph exactly, but maybe vindication, maybe justice, maybe just the simple relief of being believed. The classroom was already filling with students when they arrived, backpacks thudding onto desks, voices rising in that particular pre-bell chaos that teachers spent years learning to navigate. But the moment Ms. Halstead entered with Jamal and his mother, the noise died like someone had cut the power to a speaker. Every eye in the room tracked their movement. Jamal could feel the weight of those stares, could practically hear the questions forming in 30 different minds. Sophie Richardson sat frozen with her pencil case half open. Marcus Washington leaned forward in his seat, expression alert. And Malik looked like he was watching a movie where he already knew the ending but couldn't quite believe it was really happening. Grace stood at the back of the classroom, arms crossed, her presence a silent promise that she wasn't going anywhere until this was resolved. Ms. Halstead moved to the front, her usual confident stride replaced by something more hesitant, more careful. She stood behind her desk for a moment, hands gripping its edge, and Jamal saw her take a deep breath like someone about to jump into cold water. "Class," she began, her voice lacking its usual authoritative ring, "please take your seats. We need to have a conversation before we start our regular day." The shuffle of movement, the scrape of chairs, and then silence. Waiting silence. The kind that felt like the whole room was holding its breath. Ms. Halstead's eyes found Jamal, and there was something raw in her expression now, something that looked almost like shame. "Yesterday, during career day presentations, I made a serious mistake. Jamal Carter told our class that his father is a 4-star general in the United States Army. And instead of celebrating that fact, instead of verifying it, instead of treating Jamal with the respect and trust that every student in this classroom deserves, I accused him of lying." You could have heard a pin drop. Several students glanced at Jamal, their expression shifting from curiosity to something more complex, surprise maybe, or the dawning realization that they'd witnessed something wrong and hadn't known how to name it. "I based my accusation on assumptions," Halstead continued, and her voice was shaking now. "I looked at where Jamal lives, at his circumstances, and I decided that his truth couldn't be possible. I didn't verify. I didn't investigate. I just decided. And that was wrong. Completely, inexcusably wrong." Sophie's hand went to her mouth. Tyler Chen sat very still, his eyes wide. Even Emma Rodriguez, who usually seemed checked out during serious conversations, was paying rapt attention. This morning, Jamal's father came to school. General Solomon Carter. And yes, he is exactly who Jamal said he is, a decorated 4-star general who has served our country for over 2 decades. The security detail that some of you might have seen in the parking lot, that was for him, because that's how seriously the military takes the protection of officers at his level. Ms. Halstead paused, and when she continued, her voice was thick with emotion. "I humiliated Jamal in front of all of you. I kept him after class and pressured him to apologize for telling the truth. I made him feel small and wrong and suspicious for being exactly who he is. And I need all of you to understand that what I did wasn't just a mistake about facts. It was a failure of character. It was bias. It was prejudice. And it was harmful." She turned fully to face Jamal, and there were tears on her cheeks now, unmistakable. "Jamal, I already apologized to you in Principal Morrison's office, but I need to do it again here, in front of the same classmates who witnessed what I did to you. I'm sorry. I'm sorry for not believing you. I'm sorry for making assumptions. I'm sorry for hurting you. And I'm sorry for failing to be the kind of teacher you deserved yesterday." The classroom was absolutely silent. Jamal stood near his desk, his mother's presence at his back like a shield, and felt the enormity of the moment settling over him. This was vindication, yes, but it was also something more complicated. Watching an adult break down, watching someone confront their own failures publicly, watching the power dynamics he'd always understood implicitly, suddenly flip in a way that felt almost dizzying. "I accept your apology," he said quietly, because that's what his parents had taught him, that grace was stronger than grudges, that you could acknowledge hurt without letting it define you. But like I said before, it's not just about me. It's about everybody. Because if you assumed wrong things about me, maybe you're assuming wrong things about other people too." Ms. Halstead nodded, wiping at her face with shaking hands. "You're absolutely right. And I promise you, all of you, that I'm going to do better. I'm going to examine my biases. I'm going to verify before I accuse. And I'm going to work every single day to make sure that every student in this classroom feels respected and believed." Marcus Washington raised his hand tentatively. Ms. Halstead nodded at him, and he stood, his expression serious. "Ms. Halstead, can I say something?" "Of course, Marcus." "Yesterday, when Destiny talked about her mom being a hairstylist, you said something about appreciating all kinds of work, even if some careers require more formal education. That made it sound like her mom's job was less important than other people's parents' jobs. And that felt bad. Like, my mom's a postal worker, and she works really hard, and she's really smart, but I could tell you didn't think that was as impressive as Sophie's dad being a lawyer. The words landed like stones in still water, ripples spreading outward. Sophie shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Destiny stared at her desk, her jaw tight. Ms. Halstead closed her eyes briefly, and when she opened them, there was fresh pain there. Marcus, you're right. I said that, and it was wrong. Every person's work has dignity and value. Your mother's service as a postal worker is essential. Destiny's mother's skill as a hairstylist is a real profession that requires training and talent. And I have no business ranking people's worth based on their careers or education levels. She looked at Destiny. I owe you an apology too, Destiny. I'm sorry for diminishing your mother's work. That was disrespectful to her and to you. Destiny looked up, surprise flickering across her face, and nodded slowly. Thanks, Ms. Halstead. Malik raised his hand next, and Ms. Halstead called on him with something that looked like trepidation. Yesterday, when Jamal tried to defend himself, I stood up for him because I knew he was telling the truth. And you sent me out of the room. You punished me for supporting my friend when he was being treated unfairly. You're right, Ms. Halstead said immediately. And I'm sorry, Malik, you were being a good friend, and you were standing up for what was right, and I shut that down because it was inconvenient for me. That was wrong. Thank you for having the courage to speak up. Grace's voice came from the back of the room then, calm but carrying clearly. I want all of you students to understand something important. What happened yesterday and what's happening right now is about more than just one mistake. It's about how we treat each other when we don't understand someone's story. It's about the danger of making assumptions based on what we see on the surface. And it's about the courage it takes to admit when we're wrong. She paused, letting her words sink in. Jamal's father is a general, yes, but even if he wasn't, even if he was a postal worker or a hairstylist or worked at a restaurant or drove a bus, that wouldn't make Jamal less valuable or less worthy of being believed. Your worth doesn't come from your parents' jobs or your address or how much money your family has. It comes from who you are as a person, and every single one of you deserves to be treated with dignity and respect. Several students nodded. Tyler Chen raised his hand. Mrs. Carter, can I ask something? Why does Jamal's dad keep it secret if he's so important? Grace smiled slightly. He doesn't keep it secret exactly. But when you're in a position of authority at that level, there are security concerns. People who might want to harm you or use your family against you. So we live quietly. We don't advertise. We protect ourselves by not making ourselves obvious targets. Does that make sense? Like superheroes with secret identities, Tyler said, and several kids laughed, releasing some of the tension. Sort of like that, Grace agreed, except it's real life and the stakes are higher. Sophie Richardson's hand went up, and when Ms. Halstead nodded at her, she spoke carefully. I'm sorry, Jamal. I thought you were lying too. After Ms. Halstead said that stuff, I believed her instead of believing you, and that wasn't fair. Emma Rodriguez spoke up without raising her hand. Me too. I'm sorry, Jamal. I should have given you the benefit of the doubt. One by one, other students echoed similar sentiments. Not all of them, not everyone, but enough that Jamal felt something shifting in the room's atmosphere. The isolation he'd felt yesterday was dissolving, replaced by something that felt almost like solidarity. Ms. Halstead watched this unfold with an expression that was equal parts grief and gratitude. When the apologies had run their course, she spoke again. What I want all of you to take from this experience is that verification matters, evidence matters, and most importantly, respecting each other's humanity matters. When someone tells you their truth, your first instinct should be curiosity and respect, not suspicion. And if you do have doubts, you investigate kindly. You don't accuse publicly. She turned to her computer, pulled up something on the projector screen. It was a web page from the Department of Defense listing senior military leadership. There, among the names and photographs, was General Solomon Carter, 4 stars clearly visible on his uniform. His official biography laid out in detailed paragraphs. This is Jamal's father, Ms. Halstead said. This is public information, available to anyone who takes 30 seconds to search for it. I didn't take those 30 seconds. I didn't do my due diligence. I didn't verify before I accused. And that failure had real consequences. For Jamal, for this classroom, for all of you who learned the wrong lesson yesterday about who deserves to be believed. The bell rang then. the sound almost jarring in the heavy atmosphere. But instead of launching into the day's regular lessons, Ms. Halstead closed her laptop and faced the class again. "We're not doing our regular schedule today," she said. "Today, we're going to talk about bias, about assumptions, about the invisible rules we carry around about who seems trustworthy and who doesn't. And we're going to start examining those rules, where they come from, whether they're fair, and how they affect the way we treat each other." Grace caught Jamal's eye and gestured toward the hallway. He followed her out, leaving the classroom to continue its reckoning without him. In the quiet of the corridor, she knelt and pulled him into a fierce hug. "You okay, baby?" she murmured against his hair. "Yeah," Jamal said, and was surprised to find he meant it. "Yeah, I think I am." "You were so brave, standing in your truth like that, not backing down even when it was hard. Your father and I are so proud of you." "Is Dad really okay with missing work for this?" Grace pulled back and looked at him seriously. "Jamal, you are your father's work. You and your sister and our family, that's what all the rest of it is for. He'd move heaven and earth for you, and don't you ever doubt that." They stayed in the hallway for a few more minutes, Grace asking gentle questions about how he was feeling, whether he wanted to stay at school or come home, whether he needed anything. Jamal chose to stay, partly because he didn't want to look weak, but mostly because he wanted to see this through, wanted to be present for whatever transformation might be happening in room 204. When he returned, the class was deep in discussion. Ms. Halstead had written a question on the board. What assumptions do we make about people based on how they look or where they live? Students were calling out answers, and Halstead was writing them down without judgment or commentary. That poor people are lazy. That rich people are stuck up. That smart people wear glasses. That boys are better at math than girls. That people who don't speak English well aren't smart. The list grew longer, more specific, more uncomfortable. That black kids are good at sports but not academics. That Asian kids are all good at math. That if someone lives in a certain neighborhood, they're dangerous. Ms. Halstead let the list sit there, visible, undeniable. These are the assumptions we carry, some of us more than others, some more consciously than others. And yesterday, I acted on assumptions just like these. I looked at Jamal, looked at what I knew about his life, and decided his truth couldn't be real because it didn't match my expectations. That's what bias does. It makes us trust our assumptions more than we trust evidence or other people's lived experiences. Marcus raised his hand. But how do we stop doing that? Good question. And honestly, Marcus, it's hard. It requires constant attention. It means catching yourself when you're about to make a judgment and asking, what am I basing this on? Do I have evidence or am I just assuming? It means listening to people when they tell you who they are instead of deciding you know better. And it means being willing to be wrong and apologize when you mess up. Tyler spoke up. My dad says everyone's a little bit racist, but what matters is whether you try to fix it or not. Ms. Halstead nodded slowly. Your dad's right about the second part. We all carry biases. We're raised in a society that teaches us certain things about certain groups of people. What matters is whether we examine those biases, challenge them, and choose to act differently. What matters is whether we do the work to be better. Destiny raised her hand. Ms. Halstead, are you going to be better now? Like, really? The question was direct, almost challenging, and the classroom went quiet again. Ms. Halstead met Destiny's eyes and didn't look away. I'm going to try. I can't promise I'll be perfect. Nobody is. But I can promise that I'm going to be conscious. I'm going to verify before I judge. I'm going to give you all the benefit of the doubt. And if I mess up again, I'm going to own it and apologize and do better next time. That's the best I can offer. That's fair, Destiny said after a moment. I guess we'll see. The rest of the morning unfolded in a series of conversations that felt unprecedented in elementary school discourse. Fourth graders talking about stereotypes and prejudice and fairness with a seriousness that would have seemed impossible 24 hours earlier. Jamal participated when called on, but mostly he observed, watching his classmates grapple with concepts that he'd been living with his whole life. At lunch, something unexpected happened. As Jamal and Malik sat at their usual spot in the cafeteria, other kids started drifting over. Sophie Richardson approached first, her lunch tray held like an offering. Can I sit with you guys? She asked, her voice smaller than usual. Jamal and Malik exchanged glances. Sophie had never sat with them before, had barely acknowledged their existence outside of class interactions. But there was something genuine in her expression, something that looked like actual remorse. "Sure," Jamal said, gesturing to an empty seat. Sophie sat, and for a moment nobody spoke. Then she said, "I've been thinking about what my dad does. Being a lawyer, I mean. And how Ms. Halstead treated my presentation versus how she treated yours. And I realized she's always treated me like I'm smarter or better just because of who my parents are. And I liked that attention. I didn't question it, but it's not fair." "No," Malik agreed. "It's not. And I think I've been doing the same thing, making assumptions about people based on stupid stuff like what they wear or where they live. And I'm sorry. I want to do better." Tyler and Emma joined them next, and then Destiny, until their table was crowded with kids who'd rarely interacted before. They talked about the morning's conversation, about their own experiences with assumptions and bias, about times they'd been judged or times they'd judged others. Marcus told a story about a teacher in second grade who'd separated the class into fast learners and slow learners based on a single test, and how being labeled slow had made him believe he wasn't smart until his parents got him tested and discovered he had dyslexia. "Nobody asked why I was struggling," he said. "They just decided I wasn't trying hard enough." Emma talked about being Latina and having people automatically speak Spanish to her, even though her family had been in the United States for 4 generations, and she barely knew 20 words. "People see my last name and my skin, and they think they know my whole story," she said. "It's exhausting." The conversations continued through lunch and into recess, clusters of 4th graders processing what had happened in their classroom with the kind of raw honesty that adults often struggled to access. And gradually, Jamal felt something he hadn't expected. Not just vindication, but community. The isolation of yesterday was transforming into connection, and kids who'd been strangers or casual acquaintances were becoming something more. Witnesses, allies, fellow travelers on a journey toward understanding. By the time they returned to room 204 for afternoon classes, the energy had shifted entirely. Ms. Halstead seemed to sense it too, and instead of pushing forward with the regular curriculum, she pivoted again. "I want to propose something," she said. "What happened with Jamal was wrong, but it's also created an opportunity for all of us, including me, to learn and grow. So here's what I'm thinking. What if we created a class project around this? Around understanding bias, around learning people's real stories instead of assuming we know them, around building a classroom culture where everyone feels respected and believed." Hands shot up immediately. The enthusiasm was palpable, kids eager to channel the morning's intensity into something constructive. Ideas flew. Interview projects where students learned about each other's families, a classroom pledge about verification and respect, a bulletin board displaying facts that challenged common stereotypes, presentations about implicit bias. Ms. Halstead wrote everything down, and Jamal watched her with a complicated mixture of feelings. Part of him was still hurt, still angry about yesterday's humiliation. But another part recognized what he was seeing, genuine contrition, genuine effort to change. His father had taught him that everyone makes mistakes. What matters is what you do after. When the final bell rang, students lingered instead of bolting for the buses. Ms. Halstead called Jamal over to her desk, and several kids paused to watch, protective now in a way they hadn't been yesterday. "Jamal," she said quietly, "I know I apologized already, but I need you to understand something. What I did to you will stay with me. I'm going to remember it every time I'm tempted to make an assumption about a student, every time I'm about to judge without evidence. You've changed me, and I promise you that change is going to be permanent." "Okay," Jamal said, because what else could he say? He was 10 years old, still processing trauma that was less than 24 hours old, and an adult was telling him he'd changed her. It felt too big, too heavy, but also somehow right. "Also," Ms. Halstead added, "I spoke with Principal Morrison. The school is implementing mandatory bias training for all staff, and we're creating new protocols about student accusations, verification before interrogation, basically. So this won't happen to another kid. Not here. Not on my watch." Jamal nodded, and something loosened in his chest. "Thank you, Ms. Halstead." No, she said, her eyes shining with tears again. Thank you. For standing in your truth. For teaching me something I should have learned long ago. For being brave enough to not let me make you small. As he walked out of the school toward the bus, Malik fell into step beside him. So, his friend said, that was the most intense school day of my entire life. Tell me about it, Jamal muttered. Your dad is actually the coolest person I've ever seen. Those SUVs were like something out of a movie. Yeah, he's pretty great. Are you okay though? Like, really okay? Jamal thought about the question. Was he okay? He'd been humiliated, vindicated, apologized to, and witnessed his teacher breaking down in front of the entire class. He'd watched his classmates transform from indifferent bystanders to engaged allies. He'd seen his father command a room without raising his voice. He'd learned that truth could be both powerful and fragile, that being believed wasn't guaranteed even when you were telling the truth, and that sometimes justice required showing up with a security detail. I think so, he said finally. I mean, yesterday sucked, really sucked, but today felt like something important happened, like something changed. It did, Malik agreed. You changed it. You and your general dad and your fierce mom. You made people see things differently. The bus ride home was normal, kids shouting, laughter, the familiar route through Arlington streets. But Jamal felt different, like he was carrying something new inside him. Not just the validation of being believed, but the knowledge that he'd stood his ground and won, that his parents had stood with him, that his classmates had ultimately chosen solidarity over skepticism. When he got home, he found his mother in the kitchen preparing dinner, and his father, miraculously, impossibly, sitting at the dining room table with his laptop, having somehow rearranged his schedule to be home early. Zara was coloring at the coffee table, humming to herself, oblivious to the weight of the day. Solomon looked up when Jamal entered, and his expression was gentle. Hey, son. How was the rest of your day? Jamal dropped his backpack and crossed the room, and his father opened his arms without hesitation. Jamal fell into the hug, and for a moment he just breathed, letting the safety of home wrap around him. It was good, he said into his father's shoulder. Ms. Halstead apologized in front of everyone, and we talked about bias and assumptions, and kids were actually listening. I'm proud of you, Solomon said quietly, not just for today, but for yesterday too. For not backing down when it would have been easier to just apologize and move on. You stood in your truth, and that takes real courage. I learned it from you, Jamal said. Solomon pulled back and looked at his son seriously. You know what a 4-star general really is, Jamal? It's not just about the rank or the uniform or the security detail. It's about having the strength to stand up for what's right even when it's hard, even when people doubt you, even when the easier path would be to just go along. And son, you showed that strength yesterday and today. You're already operating at general level integrity, and you're only 10 years old. Grace appeared in the doorway, dish towel in hand, and smiled at them. Dinner's almost ready, pot roast just like I promised, and sweet potato pie for dessert because we're celebrating. Celebrating what? Zara called from the living room. Your brother being brave, Grace said, and our family standing together, and truth winning out in the end. They gathered around the table, all 4 of them, a rare occurrence given Solomon's schedule, and ate dinner with a sense of completion that felt almost ceremonial. They talked about the day's events, Jamal recounting details with increasing animation, his parents listening with focused attention, Zara occasionally interjecting with non-sequiturs about her kindergarten adventures. After dinner, after Zara had been tucked into bed and the kitchen had been cleaned, Jamal sat with his father on the couch, while his mother caught up on hospital paperwork. Solomon had changed into comfortable clothes, his formal bearing relaxed into something more approachable, and they watched a baseball game with the sound low. Dad, Jamal said during a commercial break, why do people assume things? Like, why couldn't Ms. Halstead just believe me? Solomon was quiet for a moment, considering. That's a complicated question with a complicated answer. But here's the simple version. People build mental models of how the world works. And when something doesn't fit their model, it's easier to dismiss it as wrong than to update the model. Ms. Halstead had built a model where generals' families look a certain way, live in certain places, have certain markers of status. We don't fit that model, so instead of questioning her model, she questioned you. But that's not fair. No, it's not. But Jamal, here's something important. The world isn't always fair, and people carry biases, conscious and unconscious, that affect how they see other people. That's reality. But reality can also change. People can learn, they can grow, they can examine their biases and choose to act differently. That's what we witnessed today. Do you think Ms. Halstead will really change? Solomon smiled slightly. I think she's going to try. Whether she succeeds will depend on how committed she is to the work. Changing deep-seated biases isn't easy. It requires constant vigilance and humility. But I believe people can change if they want to badly enough. And I think your teacher wants to. She looked genuinely devastated by what she'd done. I felt kind of bad for her, Jamal admitted. Is that weird? Not at all. That's called empathy, and it's a strength, not a weakness. You can hold someone accountable and still have compassion for their struggle to be better. Those things aren't mutually exclusive. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the game playing out on the screen, the apartment settling into nighttime quiet. Finally, Jamal asked the question that had been lurking in the back of his mind all day. Dad, will this happen again? Will other people not believe me about stuff? Solomon's expression grew serious. Honestly? Probably. Being a black man in America, even a black boy who's got every advantage, means facing skepticism sometimes. Means having to prove yourself in ways others don't. Means carrying the weight of other people's assumptions. That's a reality I can't shelter you from completely. He paused, making sure Jamal was listening. But here's what I can give you. The tools to handle it. The confidence to stand in your truth. The example of parents who fight for you and teach you to fight for yourself. The knowledge that your worth isn't determined by whether people believe you or not. And the understanding that every time you stand firm, every time you refuse to make yourself smaller, you're not just defending yourself, you're making it easier for the next kid who comes along. Like how you being a general makes it easier for other black soldiers. Exactly like that. Representation matters. Visibility matters. Every time someone breaks through a barrier or exceeds expectations or simply refuses to accept limitations that society tries to place on them, they're opening doors for others. That's part of service too, not just serving your country, but serving your community, your people, the future generations who'll come after you. Jamal absorbed this, feeling the weight and the promise of it settle over him. He was 10 years old, sitting in a modest apartment in Arlington, and his father was talking to him about legacy and service and the long arc of justice. It felt too big for his small life, but also exactly right. I want to make you proud, he said quietly. Solomon pulled him close. Son, you already do. Every single day. Not because of what you accomplish or how you perform, but because of who you are. Brave, honest, kind, resilient. That's what makes me proud. That's what matters. Grace appeared in the doorway then, having finished her paperwork. All right, you two. It's a school night, and Jamal needs his sleep. Jamal hugged his father goodnight, then his mother, and headed to his room. He changed into his pajamas, brushed his teeth, and climbed into bed with a sense of exhaustion that was both physical and emotional. It had been 48 hours since he'd written his career day presentation, and in that short span, everything had changed. Before he turned off his light, he looked once more at the photo of his father in dress uniform. 4 stars. 26 years of service. A man who'd fought through barriers and assumptions and skepticism to reach the highest levels of military leadership. And a father who'd dropped everything to defend his son when that son had been wronged. Jamal understood now, in a way he hadn't before, what those stars really meant. Not just rank or authority or responsibility, but the accumulated weight of every time his father had been doubted and proved the doubters wrong. Every time he'd been underestimated and exceeded expectations. Every time he'd been told what he couldn't do and done it anyway. And Jamal carried that legacy now. Not the burden of it, but the promise. The knowledge that he came from people who didn't fold, didn't shrink, didn't apologize for taking up space in the world. And yesterday and today, he'd shown he was worthy of that legacy. Tomorrow, he'd go back to school. There would be more conversations, more processing, more navigating of relationships that had been irrevocably altered by what had happened. But he'd face it with his head up, his truth intact, and the unshakable knowledge that he was believed, he was supported, and he was exactly who he'd always said he was. The son of a general, a kid from Arlington, a fourth grader who'd refused to be made small, and someone who at just 10 years old had already learned one of life's hardest lessons. The truth could be both painful and powerful, that justice required courage, and that sometimes the bravest thing you could do was simply insist on being seen for who you really were. The next morning arrived with the peculiar lightness that sometimes follows crisis, that moment after the storm when the air feels cleaner, sharper, full of possibility. Jamal woke naturally, without the knot of dread that had accompanied yesterday's dawn, and found his mother already in the kitchen wearing her regular scrubs, back to her normal schedule. "How are you feeling, baby?" she asked as he shuffled in, still rubbing sleep from his eyes. "Good, actually," he said, surprised by the truth of it. "Is that weird?" Grace smiled, pouring him orange juice. "Not weird at all. You faced something hard, you stood your ground, and you came out the other side. That's not just surviving, that's winning. Of course you feel good." The bus ride to school felt different too. Word had spread beyond room 204, carried home by 30 different students to 30 different families, transmitted through the mysterious network of parental communication that moved faster than any official channel. Kids Jamal barely knew nodded at him in the hallway. A fifth grader he'd never spoken to gave him a fist bump. Even the crossing guard, Mrs. Patterson, squeezed his shoulder and said, "Heard about what happened, honey. Good for you for standing tall." Malik met him at their lockers, grinning. "Dude, you're famous. My mom told my aunt, who told her book club, and now like half the neighborhood knows about General Carter showing up at school with a security detail. It's legendary." "I just wanted people to believe me," Jamal said, shoving his backpack into his locker. "I didn't want it to become this whole thing." "Too late. It's a thing, but like a good thing. People are talking about bias and assumptions and stuff. My mom even said she's going to check herself more before jumping to conclusions about people." Malik paused. "Also, Tyler Chen told me his parents are planning to request Ms. Halstead for his little sister next year because they were impressed she apologized and is trying to change. So somehow this might have actually helped her reputation instead of hurting it." "That's weird," Jamal said. "That's life, man. Complicated and weird." Room 204 felt transformed when they entered. The desks had been rearranged into clusters instead of rows, and Ms. Halstead had created a new bulletin board overnight titled "Our Stories Matter," with colorful paper and an invitation for students to share facts about themselves that might surprise people. She stood at the front of the room as students filed in, and there was something different about her bearing, less authoritative certainty, more open humility. "Good morning, everyone," she said when the bell rang. "Before we begin our regular lessons today, I want to follow up on yesterday's conversations. First, I've been up half the night researching implicit bias and prejudice, and I've enrolled in a professional development course on cultural competency. I'm also meeting with Principal Morrison this afternoon to discuss school-wide training for all staff." Sophie raised her hand. "Ms. Halstead, what's implicit bias?" "Good question. Implicit bias refers to the attitudes and stereotypes we hold unconsciously, the ones we might not even know we have. They affect our understanding, actions, and decisions in ways we're not always aware of. For example, I had implicit biases about what a general's family looks like that led me to doubt Jamal. I wasn't consciously thinking I'm going to be racist or classist right now. But those biases were operating underneath my conscious awareness, affecting my judgment. Marcus spoke up without raising his hand. "So how do you fix it if you don't even know you're doing it?" Another excellent question. The first step is awareness, learning about common biases and reflecting on your own thinking patterns. The second is intention, actively choosing to pause before making judgments and asking yourself what assumptions you might be making. And the third is action, changing your behavior, verifying information before drawing conclusions, and listening to people's lived experiences instead of dismissing them. She gestured to the new bulletin board. Which brings me to our first activity. I want each of you to share one fact about yourself or your family that might surprise your classmates. Something that challenges assumptions people might make about you based on how you look or where you live or any other surface-level characteristic. You don't have to share anything too personal, just something that says, "There's more to my story than you might think." The activity unfolded with surprising enthusiasm. Students began pinning up index cards with revelations that ranged from mundane to profound. Tyler Chen's card read, "My grandmother survived a labor camp during World War II and taught herself 5 languages." Sophie Richardson wrote, "My mom has depression and sees a therapist every week, and that's okay." Emma Rodriguez shared, "My dad was a professional ballet dancer in Mexico before we moved here." Marcus Washington revealed, "I have dyslexia, but I'm great at building things, and I want to be an engineer." When Jamal's turn came, he wrote carefully, "My dad is a 4-star general, and he makes the best pancakes in the world. People are more than just their jobs." Destiny Williams, who'd been quiet most of the morning, stood and pinned her card with particular emphasis. "My mom owns 3 hair salons, employs 15 people, and is taking business classes at community college. She's one of the hardest working people I know." Ms. Halstead read Destiny's card aloud, her voice thick with emotion. "Destiny, thank you for sharing that. And I want to apologize again for how I characterized your mother's work. She sounds like an incredible woman and an entrepreneur, and you should be very proud of her." "I am," Destiny said firmly. "I always have been, but yesterday made me feel like I shouldn't be. That was my failure, not yours. And I'm sorry." The bulletin board filled throughout the morning, becoming a tapestry of hidden depths and complicated stories. By lunchtime, room 204 looked different, felt different, like a space that had been cracked open and expanded to hold more complexity, more nuance, more truth. At lunch, the cafeteria buzzed with energy that had nothing to do with pizza day. Kids from other classes approached Jamal with questions, wanting to hear the story firsthand, and he found himself recounting it multiple times with varying levels of detail. Some kids were just curious about the security detail. Were there really black SUVs with tinted windows? While others wanted to understand the deeper dynamics at play. A 6th grader named Aisha cornered him by the trash cans with an intensity that suggested she had personal stakes in the conversation. "My mom's a doctor," she said without preamble. "But she's from Nigeria, and people always assume she's a nurse or a cafeteria worker or something. Even other doctors sometimes assume she can't be a physician because of her accent. It makes her so mad." "That's messed up," Jamal said. "It is, but hearing about what happened with you and your dad made my mom feel less alone, I think. Like, she called your mom a sister warrior at dinner last night." Aisha smiled slightly. "Anyway, I just wanted to say thanks for not backing down. It matters to more people than just you." Similar conversations rippled through the cafeteria, the school, the broader community. What had started as one boy's humiliation had somehow catalyzed something larger, a collective reckoning with assumptions and biases that had always been present but rarely examined so directly. That afternoon, Principal Morrison made an announcement over the intercom that sent whispers through every classroom. "Teachers and staff, effective immediately, Jefferson Elementary will be implementing new protocols regarding student discipline and accusations. Before any student is accused of dishonesty or asked to recant a statement, staff must make reasonable efforts to verify information. We will also be scheduling mandatory professional development on implicit bias and cultural competency for all employees. Our commitment is to ensure every student feels respected, believed, and valued." Ms. Halstead paused her math lesson to address the announcement. "That's a direct result of what happened in our classroom," she told her students. "Change doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens because people speak up, because wrongs get acknowledged, and because communities decide to do better. You all are part of that change now." The days that followed brought unexpected developments. A reporter from the local Arlington newspaper called Principal Morrison requesting an interview about the new bias protocols at Jefferson Elementary, which Morrison declined but which nonetheless generated buzz in the community. The PTA scheduled an emergency meeting to discuss the incident, which turned into a 3-hour conversation about systemic issues in education, representation in curriculum, and the importance of diverse perspectives in teaching. Ms. Halstead attended that PTA meeting voluntarily, Jamal's mother told him later, and spoke candidly about her mistakes, her learning process, and her commitment to change. Several parents of color thanked her afterward, Grace reported, not for what she'd done but for how she'd responded, with accountability rather than defensiveness, with genuine contrition rather than excuses. But perhaps the most significant development came from an unexpected source. 2 weeks after the initial incident, Ms. Halstead approached Jamal before class with a proposal that would reshape not just their classroom, but eventually the entire school. "Jamal, I've been thinking," she said, perching on the edge of her desk while students settled into their seats. "What happened between us was terrible, but it's also created an opportunity. I've learned so much in the past 2 weeks about my own biases, about the experiences of students I've been teaching for years without really seeing them. And I think other teachers need this learning too." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "So I've spoken with Principal Morrison about creating a student panel, a group of students who would share their experiences with bias and assumptions, who would help educate staff about what it's like to be on the receiving end of prejudice, who would essentially be consultants in making our school more equitable and inclusive. And Jamal, I'd like you to be part of that panel, if you're willing." Jamal felt Malik's eyes on him, felt the attention of nearby classmates tuning into the conversation. His first instinct was to decline. He'd already been at the center of enough drama, already exposed more of himself than felt comfortable. But then he remembered his father's words about representation, about opening doors, about service meaning more than just one person's comfort. "What would I have to do?" he asked cautiously. "Attend meetings with teachers and staff. Share your perspective when you feel comfortable. Help us understand where our blind spots are. You wouldn't be alone. We'd want at least 5 or 6 students representing different backgrounds and experiences. And you'd have full support from administration. No retaliation, no negative consequences, complete safety to speak honestly." "Can I think about it?" "Of course. Take all the time you need. I know I've given you plenty of reasons not to trust me. So if you decide you don't want to be involved, I completely understand." That evening, Jamal discussed the proposal with his parents over dinner. Zara was at a play date, so it was just the 3 of them, and the conversation ranged across territory, both practical and philosophical. Grace's initial reaction was protective. "Baby, you've already been through so much. You don't owe that school anything more than you've already given." But Solomon leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. "What do you think, son? Does the idea interest you at all?" Jamal pushed rice around his plate, considering. "I don't know. Part of me just wants everything to go back to normal. But another part thinks, if I say no, and then this happens to some other kid, I'll feel bad that I didn't help prevent it." "That's leadership thinking right there," Solomon said quietly. "Understanding that sometimes the cost of speaking up is worth it because of who it might help down the road." "But I'm tired of being the kid this happened to," Jamal admitted. "I just want to be regular again." Grace reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "You get to choose, Jamal. Nobody, not us, not your teacher, not the school, nobody gets to pressure you into being a spokesperson if that's not what you want. You've already done more than most adults would do in your situation." "But if I did say yes," Jamal said slowly, "I wouldn't have to do it alone, right? Ms. Halstead said there'd be other kids." "Right. And you could also set boundaries about what you're willing to discuss and what's off limits. You'd have control over your participation." Jamal thought about Aisha in the cafeteria, about the 6th grader whose mother dealt with assumptions about her competence every day. He thought about Destiny, initially hesitant to defend her mother's profession, but finding her voice after watching Jamal defend his father. He thought about all the kids who'd shared surprising facts on the bulletin board, revealing layers of themselves they'd kept hidden because they didn't think anyone wanted to see. "Okay," he said finally, "I'll do it, but only if Malik can be on the panel too." Solomon smiled. "Bringing reinforcements. Smart move, General." "I learned from the best," Jamal replied, and they all laughed, the kind of laughter that releases tension and affirms connection and acknowledges that sometimes, in the middle of hard things, you find moments of lightness. The student panel took shape over the following weeks with care and intentionality that surprised even the adults involved. Principal Morrison recruited a diverse group of students from grades 3 through 5. Jamal and Malik from room 204, Aisha the 6th grader whose mother was a Nigerian doctor, a 3rd grader named Carlos whose family had immigrated from El Salvador and who'd been placed in ESL despite being fluent in English, and twin sisters named Amara and Zuri, whose father was deployed overseas and whose mother struggled with PTSD from her own military service. Their first meeting happened after school in the library, with Morrison and a district diversity coordinator facilitating. The coordinator, a black woman named Dr. Tanya Williams with silver locks and kind eyes, began by setting ground rules that centered the students' comfort and agency. "You are the experts here," she told them. "Not the teachers, not the administrators, not me. You know what it's like to walk through these hallways, to sit in these classrooms, to navigate these social dynamics in ways that adults can't fully access anymore. Our job is to listen, learn, and take action based on what you tell us. Your job is only to be honest when you feel safe doing so." She paused, letting that sink in. "We're going to start with some simple questions. What's one time you felt invisible at school? What's one time you felt seen in the wrong way, stereotyped, or reduced to an assumption? What's one time you felt genuinely understood and valued for who you are?" The stories that emerged were both heartbreaking and illuminating. Carlos talked about teachers consistently correcting his English pronunciation, even though he'd been born in Arlington and spoke better English than he did Spanish. "They see my last name and they just assume," he said quietly, "like I'm fresh off the boat or something. It makes me feel like I'm not really American, even though I've never lived anywhere else." Amara and Zuri described how their mother's PTSD was treated as a discipline problem rather than a mental health issue when it affected their home life. "Teachers would say we seemed distracted or not focused, but nobody ever asked why," Amara explained. "Nobody connected the dots that maybe having a parent with trauma might affect how we show up at school." Aisha shared her mother's experiences, but also her own. How she'd been placed in regular math instead of advanced, despite testing scores that qualified her. How a counselor had suggested she might want to consider practical careers instead of medical school. How she constantly felt like she had to prove she was smart enough, disciplined enough, ambitious enough to be taken seriously. Malik, speaking quietly but firmly, talked about being labeled as too literal and overthinking things when his brain just worked differently, when his autism made him process information in ways that didn't match teacher expectations. "It's like there's one right way to be smart," he said, "and if you're smart in a different way, it doesn't count." And Jamal, when his turn came, found himself articulating something he hadn't fully understood until that moment. "The worst part wasn't just that Ms. Halstead didn't believe me. It was that she didn't even think to verify before accusing me. Like, she was so certain I must be lying that she didn't need evidence. And that made me realize that some kids get the benefit of the doubt automatically, and other kids have to earn it. And we shouldn't have to earn basic respect. That should just be the starting point." Dr. Williams took notes throughout, occasionally asking clarifying questions but mostly just witnessing. When the students finished sharing, she looked at Morrison with an expression that held both challenge and hope. "You're hearing this, Harold?" she asked. "Really hearing it?" Morrison nodded, his face troubled. "I am. And I'm realizing how much we've been failing students without even knowing it." "Oh, you knew it," Zuri said suddenly, surprising everyone with her directness. "Or you could have known it if you'd been paying attention. Kids have been trying to tell you stuff forever. Adults just don't always listen." Morrison had the grace to look ashamed. "You're right, and I apologize for that. But I'm listening now and I'm committed to making changes, real changes, not just performative ones." The panel met weekly after that, gradually expanding its scope from storytelling to actual policy recommendations. The students proposed changes that ranged from practical to profound: mandatory name pronunciation training for teachers, better accommodations for students with learning differences, culturally responsive curriculum that reflected the diversity of the student body, explicit training on how poverty affects academic performance without reflecting on intelligence or potential. They suggested creating a peer support group where students could discuss experiences with bias in a safe space, led by trained counselors who understood the particular challenges facing marginalized kids. They recommended reviewing disciplinary data to identify patterns of discriminatory enforcement. Were certain students being punished more harshly for the same behaviors? They even proposed a student feedback system where kids could anonymously report concerns about teacher bias without fear of retaliation. Some suggestions were implemented immediately. Others required district approval, budget considerations, or longer-term planning. But Morrison made something clear in every meeting. The students' voices would be centered in decision-making, not just consulted and then ignored. Ms. Halstead attended several of these meetings, always sitting at the back, always listening without defensiveness. Jamal noticed how she took notes, how her expression shifted when students described experiences that clearly resonated with something she'd done or failed to do. And slowly, grudgingly, he found himself believing that her commitment to change might be genuine. One afternoon, about 6 weeks after the original incident, she asked if she could speak with Jamal privately after a panel meeting. They sat in the library's reading corner, surrounded by bookshelves and the lingering smell of old paper, and for a moment she just looked at him with something like wonder. "I need to tell you something," she began. "Since this whole situation happened, I've been doing a lot of reflection, and I've realized that you're not my first mistake. You're just the first time I got caught." Jamal waited, unsure where this was going. "I've been teaching for 23 years, Ms. Halstead continued, and I thought I was good at it. I thought I was fair and consistent and dedicated. But listening to these panel discussions, hearing what students actually experience in classrooms, including mine, I'm realizing how many kids I've failed without even knowing it, how many assumptions I've made, how many times I've given certain students more patience or benefit of doubt than others, how many microaggressions I've committed while thinking I was just being professional." She paused, her eyes glistening. "I've been looking back through my grade books, my discipline records, my parent communication logs, and the patterns are undeniable. I've been harder on Black and brown students. I've had lower expectations for kids from low-income families. I've been quicker to praise white students for the same work I've criticized in students of color. The data doesn't lie, even when I was lying to myself about being unbiased." "Why are you telling me this?" Jamal asked quietly. "Because you deserve to know that you changed my life, Jamal. Not just my teaching practice, my actual life. The way I see the world, the way I understand my own complicity in systems of inequality, the way I approach every interaction now with more humility and awareness. You did that. A 10-year-old kid who just wanted to share something he was proud of, you fundamentally altered the trajectory of my career and my consciousness." She wiped at her eyes. "And I want you to know that I'm not stopping with myself. I'm talking to other teachers. I'm sharing what I've learned. I'm being honest about my mistakes so that maybe other educators will examine their own practices before they hurt students the way I hurt you. You sparked something, Jamal. Something important. Something that's spreading beyond just our classroom or even our school." Jamal sat with that for a moment, feeling the weight and the gift of it. "I just wanted you to believe me," he said finally. "I didn't set out to change anything." "I know, but that's how real change often happens. Someone refuses to accept injustice, stands in their truth despite the cost, and forces everyone around them to confront realities they've been ignoring. You did that, and I will spend the rest of my career trying to be worthy of the lesson you taught me." That evening, Jamal told his parents about the conversation. They sat on the back patio of their apartment complex, watching Zara chase fireflies in the twilight, and process together what the past 2 months had brought. "I'm proud of you," Solomon said, his arm around Jamal's shoulders. "Not just for handling the initial crisis, but for choosing to stay engaged afterward. That's the harder work, honestly. Not the dramatic confrontation, but the slow, steady effort of rebuilding trust and creating change." "Do you think Ms. Halstead really changed?" Jamal asked. "Or is she just scared of getting in trouble again?" Grace considered the question carefully. "I think both can be true at the same time. She might have been scared initially, and that fear might have motivated her to start examining her behavior. But from what I've heard from other parents, from what you've observed in panel meetings, from the actual policy changes happening at school, I think she's moved beyond just fear into genuine transformation. People can surprise you sometimes, baby. They can choose to grow instead of staying defensive." Plus, Solomon added, even if her motivation started from fear, if the outcome is that she treats students more fairly and examines her biases and helps other teachers do the same, then the result is still positive. We don't always get to know people's hearts. We can only judge their actions, and her actions have been consistently moving in the right direction. Jamal watched his sister's joyful pursuit of lightning bugs, her laughter punctuating the evening air, and felt something settle in him. Maybe this was what resolution looked like. Not perfect, not simple, but real. Messy and complicated, and requiring ongoing effort from everyone involved. The school year continued its arc towards summer, and room 204 became something of a laboratory for inclusive teaching practices. Other teachers started visiting to observe how Ms. Halstead had restructured her classroom culture, how she checked her assumptions, how she created space for students to be fully themselves. The Our Stories Matter bulletin board expanded to fill an entire wall, then spilled into the hallway, becoming a living document of the fourth grade's complexity and diversity. Jamal found himself in the strange position of being both regular kid and minor legend, still just a fourth grader who struggled with long division and loved recess basketball, but also someone whose name carried weight in adult conversations about equity and inclusion. He learned to navigate that duality, to be ordinary and extraordinary simultaneously, to understand that surviving something hard didn't make you responsible for fixing everything, but also gave you a platform to advocate for those who couldn't yet speak for themselves. The student panel's recommendations bore fruit throughout the spring. The school implemented bias training that was actually substantive rather than performative, bringing in Dr. Williams quarterly to work with staff on examining their practices. They created the peer support group Jamal had suggested, which quickly became one of the most popular after-school programs. They revised disciplinary procedures to require verification and multiple data points before accusing students of dishonesty. And perhaps most significantly, they began tracking and analyzing their own data with new rigor, looking at grade distributions by race and socioeconomic status, examining disciplinary referrals for patterns of bias, surveying students about their experiences with fairness and inclusion. The numbers told uncomfortable stories, but Morrison, to his credit, didn't hide from them. He shared them with the PTA, with the district, with anyone who would listen, and used them to push for systemic changes that went beyond just Jefferson Elementary. As the school year drew to a close, Ms. Halstead did something unexpected. She invited Jamal's parents to a small end-of-year gathering in her classroom. Just them, no other families, no formal agenda. They arrived on a Friday evening to find the room arranged with adult-sized chairs in a circle and a table with refreshments that Halstead had clearly agonized over. "Thank you for coming," she said as they settled in, Grace and Solomon on either side of Jamal. "I wanted to do this privately because what I need to say is personal, not performative, and I needed to say it face to face." She took a breath, steadying herself. "General Carter, Mrs. Carter, Jamal, I owe you a debt I can never fully repay. Not just because you held me accountable, though that was necessary, but because you gave me the chance to become better rather than simply being condemned for my worst moment. You could have destroyed my career and you would have been justified in doing so. Instead, you gave me the opportunity to learn, to grow, to transform my practice and my understanding." Solomon's expression was unreadable. "We didn't do that for you, Ms. Halstead. We did it for our son and for every student who comes after him." "I know, but the outcome was that I got to keep teaching, got to apply what I learned, got to hopefully help more students because of the lessons you taught me, and I don't take that lightly. Every day, I think about the choice you made to pursue accountability and change rather than just punishment. That's grace I didn't deserve, but that I'm trying to honor." Grace leaned forward slightly. "Ms. Halstead, can I ask you something? If this happened again tomorrow, if a student told you something that seemed unlikely based on your assumptions about their background, what would you do differently?" Halstead didn't hesitate. "I'd pause. I'd recognize that my initial skepticism might be rooted in bias rather than evidence. I'd verify through appropriate channels before drawing any conclusions. I'd give the student the benefit of the doubt. And if I couldn't verify immediately, I'd hold space for uncertainty rather than rushing to judgment. Most importantly, I'd remember that people's lives are always more complex than they appear on the surface, and that my limited perspective doesn't define anyone else's reality." "That's exactly right," Grace said, something softening in her posture. "And you know what? I believe you mean that. I believe you've done the work to get there." Tears spilled down Halstead's cheeks. "Thank you. That means more than you know." They talked for another hour about the panel's impact, about changes happening at the district level, about Jamal's plans for 5th grade, about everything and nothing. And by the end, Jamal noticed something remarkable. His parents and Ms. Halstead were laughing together, sharing stories about teaching and parenting and the complicated work of trying to do better in a world that made doing better so hard. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, Too much had happened for it to be that simple, but it was something equally important. Recognition that people could fail spectacularly and still choose redemption, that institutions could perpetuate harm and still commit to change, that wounds could heal even when scars remained. As they walked to their car later, Zara asleep in Solomon's arms and Grace's hand warm in his, Jamal felt the chapter finally, truly closing. Not erased. He'd carry this experience forever, would always remember being publicly doubted and then dramatically vindicated, but closed in the sense that it no longer defined him, no longer occupied every waking thought, no longer felt like an open wound. He was just Jamal again, a kid whose dad happened to be a general and whose mom happened to be fierce, and who happened to have learned some hard lessons about justice and bias and standing in truth. A kid who'd made a difference without meaning to, who'd changed his school by simply refusing to accept being diminished, who'd discovered that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the willingness to stand firm despite it. Fourth grade ended the way fourth grades do, with field day competitions and yearbook signings and promises to stay in touch over summer. But for Jamal and his classmates, it ended with something additional. The knowledge that they'd lived through something transformative, that their classroom had become a crucible for real change, and that sometimes, when you least expect it, telling a simple truth about who your father is can spark a revolution. The story could have ended there, with closure and growth and everyone learning their lessons. But life, as Jamal was discovering, rarely wrapped itself up that neatly. And the final chapter of this particular story was still waiting to unfold. One last twist that would bring everything full circle in a way nobody could have predicted. Summer arrived with the kind of heat that made Arlington shimmer, turning pavement into waves and pushing kids toward sprinklers and community pools. Jamal spent the first weeks of vacation the way most 10-year-olds did, sleeping late, playing basketball with Malik at the neighborhood court, helping his mother with Zara, existing in that blessed space where school felt like a distant memory and responsibility meant remembering to drink water. But the phone call that came on a humid Tuesday in late June changed everything. Jamal was reading on the couch, his father unexpectedly home for a rare weekday afternoon, when Grace's cell phone rang. She answered with her usual warmth, then went very still, her expression shifting through surprise to something more complex. "Yes, this is she," Grace said carefully. "I see. When would this be? And you're certain about the venue?" A pause. "Let me discuss it with my family and I'll call you back within the hour." She ended the call and looked at Solomon with an expression Jamal couldn't quite read. That was the Arlington County School Board. "They want our family to speak at the annual education summit in August. Specifically, they want Jamal to share his story as part of a keynote on equity and inclusion in schools." Jamal's stomach dropped. "What? Why would they want me?" Solomon set down his coffee, immediately focused. "What exactly are they proposing?" Grace consulted her notes. "The summit brings together educators, administrators, and policymakers from across the county. This year's theme is From Awareness to Action, Creating Truly Inclusive Schools. They want to feature Jamal's experience as a case study of how one incident can catalyze systemic change. They're also inviting Ms. Halstead to speak about her transformation process, and they want our family to participate in a panel discussion afterward." "Absolutely not," Solomon said immediately. "They're not putting our son on display like some kind of cautionary tale mascot." "Dad, wait," Jamal started, surprising himself. "No, Jamal, you've already given enough. You don't owe the school system a performance." But Grace was watching Jamal with careful attention. "What were you going to say, baby?" Jamal struggled to articulate the feeling forming in his chest. "I don't want to be on display, but Dr. Williams said something in one of our panel meetings about how change happens when stories become public, when people can't ignore what's happening anymore. And I keep thinking about all the kids at that summit who might be dealing with the same stuff I dealt with. What if hearing about it helps them?" "That's not your responsibility," Solomon said firmly, but his expression had softened slightly. "I know, but what if I want it to be?" Jamal looked at his father directly. "You always talk about service, about how leadership means putting others first even when it's uncomfortable. Isn't this the same thing, using my experience to help other people?" Grace and Solomon exchanged one of those silent parental communications that contained entire conversations. Finally, Grace spoke. "If you did this, and that's a big if. You'd have complete control over what you share and how you share it. We'd be there with you every step of the way, and the moment you felt uncomfortable or wanted to stop, we'd stop. No questions asked. And we'd want to see the format ahead of time, Solomon added, shifting into planning mode despite his reservations. Know exactly what they're asking, who else is speaking, what the structure is. No surprises. Can I think about it? Jamal asked. Take all the time you need, Grace assured him. Over the next week, Jamal wrestled with the decision. He talked to Malik, who thought speaking at the summit sounded terrifying, but also kind of cool. He talked to the other student panel members, who were universally supportive, but emphasized that he shouldn't feel pressured. He even talked to Ms. Halstead, who'd called Grace to express her discomfort with being positioned as some kind of redemption story. I don't want to profit off your pain, Jamal, she'd said when they met at a coffee shop halfway between their homes. If you decide to speak, I'll support whatever you want to say about me, even if it's critical. You don't owe me protection or favorable framing. But you did change, Jamal pointed out. That's just true. Would it be lying to say you didn't? No, but there's a difference between acknowledging growth and making it seem like everything's fine now. The damage I caused didn't disappear just because I apologized and did some training. You still carry that. And any story we tell needs to honor that reality. It was that conversation that helped Jamal clarify his thinking. The next evening, he told his parents he wanted to do it, but only if he could tell the whole truth, including the parts that still hurt, including the ongoing work of healing and change, including the fact that one person's transformation didn't erase systemic problems. Grace called the school board back with a list of non-negotiable conditions. Jamal would speak for no more than 10 minutes. He could review and approve any promotional materials that mentioned him. The panel discussion would have a professional moderator trained in trauma-informed facilitation, and the Carter family retained the right to withdraw at any point without penalty. The school board agreed to everything. The next 6 weeks passed in a blur of preparation. Dr. Williams helped Jamal craft his remarks, teaching him how to tell his story in a way that was honest but boundaried, powerful but not re-traumatizing. They practiced answering difficult questions, discussed how to handle emotions if they arose, and created a signal system so his parents would know if he needed to step away. Ms. Halstead was preparing her own remarks separately, but she checked in with Jamal regularly to make sure she wasn't planning to say anything that would blindside him or cause harm. Your comfort matters more than my narrative, she kept insisting, and gradually Jamal began to believe she meant it. The weekend before the summit, Solomon sat down with Jamal for what he called a pre-mission briefing, which made Jamal laugh despite his nerves. You've been through intense training for this, Solomon said seriously. You know your story, you know your talking points, you know how to handle curveballs. But I want to remind you of something important. You're not a trained performer. You're a kid sharing your experience. If you get emotional, that's okay. If you need to pause, that's okay. If you decide mid-speech that you can't continue, that's okay. There's no such thing as failure here. Only courage. What if I mess up? What if I forget what I'm supposed to say? Then you say something else, or you pause and collect your thoughts, or you look at your mom and me in the front row and remember that we've got you no matter what. Solomon pulled Jamal close. Son, you've already done the hard part. You've lived through something painful and come out the other side stronger. Talking about it is just sharing what you've already survived. The morning of the summit arrived with unseasonable coolness, as if the weather itself was offering mercy. The venue was the Arlington Convention Center, a sprawling facility that seemed enormous to Jamal as they approached. Educators streamed through the entrance, name tags identifying them as teachers, principals, counselors, district administrators from across the county. Backstage, the energy was controlled chaos. A production coordinator fitted Jamal with a microphone, explaining how it worked while Grace and Solomon flanked him protectively. Dr. Williams appeared with bottles of water and encouraging smiles. And then Ms. Halstead arrived, looking more nervous than Jamal had ever seen her. I'm terrified, she admitted when Jamal asked how she was doing. Which seems appropriate, honestly. I should be uncomfortable sharing my failures publicly. That's part of the accountability. The summit's opening remarks set the tone, the superintendent acknowledging that the district had work to do around equity, that awareness wasn't enough without action, that they were gathered to learn from difficult truths. Then Dr. Williams took the stage to introduce the keynote segment. This year, she began, her voice carrying clearly through the packed auditorium, we're going to do something different. Instead of hearing from an expert or researcher, we're going to hear from the people who live the realities we're trying to address. First, we'll hear from Jamal Carter, a rising fifth grader who experienced bias in his classroom and chose to respond with courage and grace. Then we'll hear from Diane Halstead, a veteran teacher who made a serious mistake and chose accountability over defensiveness. And finally, we'll discuss together how we move from individual transformation to systemic change. The audience applauded, and Jamal felt his heart hammering as he walked onto the stage. The lights were bright, making it hard to see faces, but he found his parents in the front row exactly where they'd promised to be. Grace gave him a subtle thumbs up. Solomon nodded once, firmly, a gesture that said, "You've got this." Jamal approached the microphone, adjusted it to his height, and took a breath. Then he began. My name is Jamal Carter, and I'm 10 years old. Last October, I went to school on career day, excited to share something I was proud of, my father's military service. My dad is a 4-star general, which is a really high rank that only a few people ever achieve. I thought people would be impressed, or at least interested. Instead, my teacher accused me of lying in front of my entire class. The auditorium was absolutely silent. Jamal could feel hundreds of eyes on him, but he focused on his parents and continued. Ms. Halstead looked at where I live, looked at my clothes, looked at what she thought she knew about my life, and decided my truth couldn't be real. She didn't verify. She didn't investigate. She just assumed I was making things up to seem more important than I was. And then she kept me after class and tried to pressure me into apologizing for telling the truth. He paused, letting that sink in. I'm not telling you this to make Ms. Halstead look bad. I'm telling you this because I need you to understand what it feels like to have adults decide you're lying before you even finish speaking. To know that some kids in your class get believed automatically while others have to prove themselves. To realize that your teacher already made up her mind about who you are based on things that have nothing to do with your character or intelligence or honesty. Jamal glanced at his notes, then decided to speak from the heart instead. The worst part wasn't even the accusation. It was the isolation. Standing in front of my classmates and knowing they were choosing to believe my teacher instead of me because she was the adult and I was just a kid. Feeling like the truth didn't matter if nobody was willing to listen to it. Several people in the audience shifted uncomfortably. Jamal saw some educators nodding, others looking stricken, all of them paying attention. But here's what I want you to know. This story isn't just about one teacher making one mistake. It's about systems that teach us who's believable and who isn't based on race and class and all these other things that shouldn't matter. Ms. Halstead had been teaching for 23 years, and I probably wasn't the first kid she doubted unfairly. I was just the first time someone showed up with evidence she couldn't ignore. He took a sip of water, his hands steadier now. After my dad came to school and proved I'd been telling the truth, Ms. Halstead apologized. And she didn't just apologize. She actually changed. She examined her biases. She restructured her teaching. She helped create new policies at our school, and she's about to come up here and tell you about that process. Jamal looked directly at the section where he knew Ms. Halstead was waiting off stage. I want to be clear about something. Ms. Halstead's transformation doesn't erase what she did to me. I still remember how it felt to be called a liar. I still carry that hurt. But I also believe people can change if they're willing to do the hard work. And I think it's important for students to see adults model accountability, to admit mistakes, to learn from them, to actually become better instead of just saying sorry and moving on. He was nearing the end of his prepared remarks now, and he felt something loosening in his chest. I'm speaking to you today because I want things to be better for other kids. I want teachers to pause before they assume. I want schools to verify before they accuse. I want every student to feel like their truth matters, like they deserve to be believed, like they're worthy of respect regardless of where they live or what their parents do or what they look like. His voice grew stronger, more certain. Change is possible. I've seen it happen in my own classroom, in my own school, but it requires adults to be willing to look at themselves honestly, to admit when they've caused harm, and to commit to doing better even when it's uncomfortable. So I guess what I'm asking is, are you willing to do that? Are you willing to examine your own biases? Are you willing to create classrooms where every kid feels safe bringing their whole truth? He paused, meeting the eyes of educators scattered throughout the auditorium. Because if you're really committed to change, then I'm willing to believe you. Just like I eventually chose to believe Ms. Halstead when she showed me through her actions that she meant what she said. That's what faith looks like, giving people the chance to prove they're serious about being better. And that's what I'm offering you today. The applause that followed was thunderous, but Jamal barely heard it. He was focused on getting off the stage without his legs giving out, on reaching his mother's embrace, on letting himself feel the full weight of what he'd just done. Grace held him tight while the audience continued clapping, and he felt tears he hadn't expected pressing against his eyes. "You were perfect," Grace whispered. "So brave, so eloquent. I've never been more proud." Solomon's hand settled on his shoulder, steady and warm. "That's leadership, son. Real leadership. Speaking truth to power with grace and strength." Ms. Halstead took the stage next, and Jamal watched from the wings as she approached the microphone with visible trepidation. She looked older somehow, the weight of what she was about to share visible in her posture. "My name is Diane Halstead," she began, her voice shaking slightly. "I've been teaching for 23 years, and until last October I thought I was pretty good at it. I thought I was fair, dedicated, committed to all my students equally. And then I destroyed a 10-year-old boy's sense of safety in his own classroom, and I had to confront the reality that I'd been operating from bias and prejudice for my entire career without even knowing it." The auditorium was riveted. Educators leaned forward, many taking notes, as Halstead continued. "When Jamal told our class his father was a 4-star general, my immediate reaction was skepticism. Not curiosity, not interest. Skepticism. And if I'm being completely honest, that skepticism was rooted in assumptions I'd made about his family based on superficial observations. He lived in a modest apartment. His mother took public transportation. He was on the free lunch program. And somewhere in my mind, I'd decided that generals' families looked different, lived different, presented different." She paused, visibly struggling with emotion. "I didn't verify his claim. I didn't do basic research. I didn't give him the benefit of the doubt. I just decided he was lying, and then I doubled down. I kept him after class. I pressured him to confess. I planned to make him apologize publicly. I exercised power over a child in ways that were abusive, even if I didn't recognize them as such in the moment." Several audience members wiped at their eyes. Others sat stone-faced, perhaps seeing themselves in Halstead's confession. "The day General Carter walked into my classroom with a security detail, I experienced something I can only describe as complete ego death. Every assumption I'd made evaporated instantly. Every certainty I'd carried about my own fairness and judgment crumbled. And I had to face the reality that I'd harmed a child based on prejudices I didn't even know I held." Halstead's voice grew stronger now, more determined. "But here's what I want you to understand. The moment of being caught wasn't the transformation. The transformation has been the months of work since then, examining every interaction I have with students through the lens of potential bias, reviewing my grading records and seeing undeniable patterns of discrimination, attending training after training, reading book after book, having uncomfortable conversation after uncomfortable conversation about race and class and privilege." She looked directly at the audience. "I cannot undo what I did to Jamal. That harm is permanent, even as he's chosen to forgive me, and even as we've built a new relationship based on honesty and accountability. But what I can do is make sure I never harm another student that way. And what I can do is stand before you today and say, if you think you're immune to bias, you're wrong. If you think you treat all students equally, examine your data. If you think awareness is enough, it's not. Change requires constant, uncomfortable, ongoing work." The panel discussion that followed was moderated by Dr. Williams with skill and sensitivity. Questions came from the audience, some defensive, some genuinely curious, all of them revealing the complexity of the work ahead. One teacher asked, "How do we balance verification with not making students feel like they're constantly being interrogated?" Jamal answered before Dr. Williams could redirect. "You believe us first. You verify quietly if you need to, but you don't accuse publicly. You give us the benefit of the doubt the same way you would for kids whose families look a certain way." Another educator asked Ms. Halstead, "How do you live with knowing you caused that kind of harm?" Halstead's answer was unflinching. uncomfortably. I live with it uncomfortably, which is appropriate. The discomfort motivates me to be better every single day. The moment I get comfortable, the moment I think I've arrived at some endpoint of being perfectly unbiased, that's when I become dangerous again. A principal from a neighboring district asked Grace and Solomon, "What do you need from schools to trust them with your children?" Solomon fielded that one. Accountability, not perfection. We know teachers are human and will make mistakes. But accountability. When harm happens, acknowledge it, address it, and implement systems to prevent it from happening again. That's what Jefferson Elementary did, and that's why we chose to keep Jamal enrolled there instead of transferring him out. Grace added, "And listen to your students, especially your students of color, your low-income students, your students who don't fit neat categories. They're telling you things all the time about their experiences. You just have to be willing to hear them." The summit continued for the rest of the day with breakout sessions, workshops, and policy discussions. But the keynote segment had set a tone that rippled through every conversation, raw, honest, refusing to let anyone hide behind comfortable platitudes about diversity and inclusion. During lunch, something unexpected happened. A steady stream of educators approached the Carter family table, some to thank Jamal for his bravery, others to share their own stories of bias and transformation, still others to ask for advice on implementing similar student panels in their schools. One black teacher in her 60s pulled Jamal aside and said quietly, "I've been teaching for 40 years, and I've never seen a student articulate these issues the way you did today. You gave voice to experiences I've had but couldn't quite name. Thank you for that gift." A young white teacher, clearly fresh out of college, approached with tears streaming down her face. "I think I've been doing what Ms. Halstead did, making assumptions, treating students differently without realizing it. You've opened my eyes, and I promise I'm going to do better." Ms. Halstead spent her lunch break in what appeared to be intense conversations with other teachers, and Jamal overheard snippets that suggested she was being both praised for her honesty and challenged by colleagues who felt implicated by her confession. By the time the summit concluded in late afternoon, Jamal felt hollowed out and filled up simultaneously, exhausted by the emotional labor of revisiting trauma, energized by the clear evidence that his story had landed, that people were listening, that change might actually be possible on a scale larger than just one classroom. In the car ride home, his family was quiet at first, everyone processing in their own way. Then Zara, who'd spent the day with Grace's mother, asked innocently, "Did you have a good day, Jamal?" He thought about the question, about what constituted a good day when you'd spent it publicly discussing one of the worst experiences of your life. "Yeah," he said finally. "I think I did. I think I helped some people understand things they didn't understand before." "That's what heroes do," Zara declared with the certainty only a 5-year-old could muster. Solomon caught Jamal's eye in the rearview mirror and smiled. "Your sister's not wrong." The weeks following the summit brought unexpected ripples. The local news picked up the story, leading to a brief media whirlwind that Grace carefully controlled, approving only one interview with a reporter who agreed to focus on systemic issues rather than just personal drama. The school district officially adopted the student panel model, funding its implementation across all elementary schools. And perhaps most significantly, the State Department of Education reached out about potentially developing a training curriculum based on Jefferson Elementary's transformation. Ms. Halstead was asked to speak at 3 more conferences that fall, always with the caveat that her participation was contingent on Jamal's comfort with how his story was being used. She consistently checked in, shared her planned remarks in advance, and made clear that she understood she was forever accountable to the child she'd harmed. As summer shifted toward fall and 5th grade loomed, Jamal found himself in a strange new normal. He was still just a kid, still played basketball with Malik, still argued with Zara about TV remote control, still struggled with math homework and loved science class. But he also carried something additional now. The knowledge that his voice mattered, that his experience had value beyond just himself, that standing in truth could spark change even when it was terrifying. On the last day before school started, Grace suggested a family dinner at Jamal's favorite restaurant, a soul food place near the hospital where the mac and cheese was legendary, and the sweet tea was exactly the right amount of sweet. They sat in a booth in the back, and Solomon raised his glass of tea and a toast. "To Jamal," he said, Who taught his family, his teacher, his school, and his entire school district what courage looks like. We're proud of you, son, not because of what you accomplished, but because of who you are. To Jamal, Zara echoed enthusiastically, sloshing her lemonade. Grace added, and to hard conversations, to accountability, to change that actually changes things, and to this family, which stands together no matter what. They clinked glasses, and Jamal felt something complete inside him, not closure exactly, because the work was ongoing, but rather a sense of integration, the hurt and the healing, the trauma and the transformation, the personal and the political, all of it woven together into something that felt whole. That night, lying in bed staring at the glow-in-the-dark stars on his ceiling, Jamal thought about everything that had happened since last October. He'd been humiliated, vindicated, transformed into an unlikely advocate for change. He'd watched an adult confront her failures and choose growth. He'd discovered that his voice could move systems that seemed immovable. And he'd learned that sometimes the hardest battles weren't against obvious enemies, but against invisible assumptions, against the stories people told themselves about who deserved to be believed. His phone buzzed with a text from Malik. Ready for tomorrow? 5th grade, here we come. Jamal smiled and typed back, ready as I'll ever be. But the truth was more complicated than that simple response. He wasn't just ready for 5th grade. He was ready for whatever came next. More challenges, more opportunities to speak truth, more chances to make the world slightly better than he'd found it. Because that's what his parents had taught him, what his experience had reinforced, what he now understood in his bones. Service wasn't just something soldiers did, wasn't just his father's job, wasn't just a concept to be discussed in classrooms. Service was standing up when it would be easier to sit down. Service was speaking truth when silence would be safer. Service was choosing grace without surrendering accountability. Service was doing the hard thing, the right thing, even when, especially when, it cost you something. Jamal Carter was 10 years old, about to start 5th grade, living in a modest apartment in Arlington with a family that loved him fiercely. His father was a 4-star general. His mother was a warrior in nurses' scrubs. His sister was a tornado of joy and energy. And he was exactly who he'd always been. A kid who told the truth, who refused to be made small, who discovered that sometimes the most radical thing you could do was simply insist on being seen for who you really were. The story that had begun with a career day presentation and a teacher's prejudice had transformed into something larger. A case study in accountability, a blueprint for change, a reminder that children often understand justice more clearly than the adults who claim to be teaching them. And as Jamal drifted toward sleep, he carried with him not just the memory of pain, but the knowledge of his own power. The power to survive hard things, the power to spark transformation, the power to stand in truth and force the world to expand to accommodate that truth, rather than diminishing himself to fit the world's narrow expectations. Tomorrow, he'd walk into Jefferson Elementary as a 5th grader. But he'd also walk in as someone who'd changed that building, who'd made it safer and more equitable for every student who came after him. And that knowledge, that his suffering had purpose, that his courage had consequences, that his story had helped rewrite other stories, made all of it somehow worth it. The night settled over Arlington, quiet and ordinary and full of possibility. And in a modest apartment on the 2nd floor, a general's son slept peacefully, dreaming of basketball games and science projects and all the normal, beautiful, complicated parts of being 10 years old, forever changed by what he'd survived, but never defined by it, always more than the sum of his struggles, eternally and completely himself.